Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories, here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the Mark Twain National Forest, Missouri, last fall. The morning fog lay thick over the forest floor as I made my way along the trail, the weight of my backpack pressing into my shoulders. 3 days into my solo hiking trip, and I was still adjusting to the silence. As a journalist for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, I was used to the constant noise of the newsroom, the perpetual deadline pressure. This trip was supposed to be my escape, a chance to clear my head and find inspiration for the feature I'd been struggling to write about people who seek solitude in nature. The irony wasn't lost on me. My therapist had suggested this trip after my panic attacks had grown more frequent. Following my divorce from Alan last year, I'd thrown myself into work, rarely taking time to process what had happened. "You need to face your fears, Jennifer," Dr. Sullivan had said during our last session. "Your fear of being alone is holding you back." So here I was, facing my fear in the most literal way possible. A 7-day solo hike through one of Missouri's most remote areas. My route would take me through a section of the Mark Twain National Forest that tourists rarely visited, especially in the fall when the summer crowds had disappeared and the winter hikers hadn't yet arrived. I checked my GPS and confirmed I was on track to reach Blair Creek by nightfall. I'd planned to camp there, beside a small waterfall I'd read about in a hiking forum. The poster had described it as hauntingly beautiful, which seemed like precisely the kind of place where I might find the inspiration I needed. The trail narrowed as I descended into a valley, the trees growing denser on either side. The forest was older here, the trees taller, their branches forming a cathedral-like canopy that filtered the sunlight into ghostly beams. Despite the beauty, something felt off. The usual forest sounds, birds, insects, the scurrying of small animals, had gone quiet. I told myself it was just the weather changing. The forecast had mentioned storms might roll in later that week. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I caught a flash of movement in my peripheral vision. I stopped and turned, scanning the trees. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small in the vastness of the forest. "Is someone there?" No response, just the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. I shook my head, attributing the movement to a deer or perhaps a fox. Wildlife was abundant in these parts. I continued walking but couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. The weight of unseen eyes pressed against the back of my neck, raising the fine hairs there. I quickened my pace, eager to reach the creek before the light faded completely. 2 hours later, I arrived at Blair Creek. The small waterfall was indeed beautiful. Water cascading about 15 feet down a series of moss-covered rocks into a clear pool below. I set up my tent on a flat area about 30 feet from the water's edge, far enough to be safe if the creek rose overnight, but close enough to hear the soothing sound of flowing water. After setting up camp, I collected wood for a fire. The temperature was dropping rapidly as the sun disappeared behind the hills. I had just got the fire going when I heard it. A voice, barely audible over the sound of the waterfall. "Help, please." I froze, my hands still holding the stick I'd been using to adjust the logs. I stood slowly, peering into the gathering darkness. "Hello?" I called. "Is someone hurt?" Silence. Then, "Help me, please." The voice seemed to be coming from downstream, past where the creek bent around a large outcropping of rocks. I grabbed my headlamp from my tent and switched it on. "I'm coming," I shouted, adrenaline pushing aside my fear. Someone was in trouble, and I was the only one around to help. I followed the creek, my headlamp cutting a narrow path through the darkness. The beam bounced off the water's surface, creating disorienting reflections that made it difficult to see. The voice had stopped, but I pressed on, convinced that someone needed my help. Around the bend, the creek widened, forming a small pond before continuing downstream. My headlamp swept across the water's surface, revealing nothing unusual. I was about to call out again when my light caught something at the pond's edge, a small pile of clothes. I approached cautiously. They were women's clothes. A red flannel shirt, jeans, hiking boots, and a gray knit hat, all neatly folded, as if someone had decided to go for a swim and had carefully arranged their belongings before entering the water. But the night was cold. The water temperature couldn't be more than 50 degrees. No one would willingly swim in these conditions. "Hello?" I called again, swinging my light across the pond. "Are you out there? Do you need help?" The surface of the water remained still, reflecting my headlamp like a mirror. Then, near the center of the pond, bubbles rose to the surface. A lot of bubbles, as if something large was moving beneath the water. I backed away from the edge, suddenly aware of how exposed I was. I told myself it was probably just a large fish, or maybe a beaver, but the explanation felt hollow. The clothes bothered me. Why would someone leave their clothes here? And where were they now? I turned to head back to my camp when my light caught something else. Footprints in the mud leading away from the pile of clothes. Barefoot prints, heading not toward the pond but into the forest, away from the creek. I followed them with my light until they disappeared into the underbrush. The smart thing would have been to return to my camp, to secure my tent and wait until morning. But the journalist in me, the part that had won awards for investigating stories others were afraid to chase, couldn't let it go. Someone might be in danger, possibly hypothermic and disoriented, wandering through the forest without clothes. I followed the footprints into the trees. The forest was different at night, transformed into a labyrinth of shadows. My headlamp illuminated only a small portion of what lay ahead, and the trees seemed to close in behind me as I passed. The footprints were becoming harder to track as the ground grew rockier, but I pressed on, calling out occasionally, hoping for a response. After about 10 minutes of walking, I came to a small clearing. In the center stood a decrepit cabin, its roof partially collapsed, its wooden walls gray with age. No light shone from within, no smoke rose from the crumbling stone chimney. "Hello?" I called, approaching the cabin. "Is anyone here? Do you need help?" My voice echoed in the clearing, met only with silence. The footprints led directly to the cabin's door, which hung askew on rusted hinges. Taking a deep breath, I stepped onto the porch, the boards creaking ominously under my weight. I pushed the door open, wincing at the loud squeal of the hinges. My headlamp revealed a single room, mostly empty except for an old iron stove, a broken table, and what might have once been a bed frame. Dust covered everything, disturbed only by the footprints that led across the floor to another door on the far side of the cabin. I followed them, my heart pounding. The second door opened onto a crude set of stairs descending into darkness. The footprints continued down these stairs, vanishing into the black void below. A basement. Something about that struck me as wrong. Cabins like this, built by pioneers or hunters, rarely had basements. The ground was too rocky, the work too difficult without machinery. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, every instinct telling me to turn back. But what if someone was down there, injured and unable to respond? I couldn't leave without knowing. "I'm coming down," I announced, my voice wavering. "If you're hurt, I can help you." I took the stairs slowly, testing each one before putting my full weight on it. The wood was rotting, and several steps were missing entirely. The air grew colder as I descended, carrying a musty, organic smell that reminded me of mushrooms and wet earth. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a low-ceilinged room carved directly into the bedrock. My headlamp revealed walls of rough stone, glistening with moisture. The footprints continued across the dirt floor, leading to a dark opening in the far wall. A tunnel. The sight of it sent a chill through me. This wasn't a basement. It was the entrance to a cave system. The cabin had been built over a natural cave opening, Or perhaps the cave had been dug out beneath an existing structure. I approached the tunnel entrance cautiously. It was about 4 feet high, forcing me to duck to see inside. The footprints disappeared into the darkness beyond the reach of my light. "Hello?" I called into the tunnel, my voice echoing strangely. "Is anyone in there?" A sound came from deep within the tunnel, a soft scraping like nails on stone. Then, faintly, "Help me." The voice was definitely coming from inside the tunnel. I hesitated, weighing my options. I could go back to my camp and use my satellite phone to call for help, but that would mean leaving whoever was in there alone for hours, possibly overnight. They could be injured or suffering from hypothermia. By the time help arrived, it might be too late. With a deep breath, I got down on my hands and knees and entered the tunnel. The passage was tight, forcing me to crawl. The stone was cold and damp beneath my palms, and I could feel water seeping through the knees of my hiking pants. My headlamp illuminated only a few feet ahead, the beam swallowed by the absolute darkness beyond. I crawled for what seemed like an eternity, though it was probably only a few minutes. The tunnel began to widen, allowing me to stand in a crouch. The air changed, becoming stagnant and heavy with an unpleasant odor that I couldn't quite identify, something organic and decaying. Finally, the tunnel opened into a large chamber. I straightened, sweeping my light across the space. The ceiling rose at least 20 feet above me, covered in stalactites that glistened wetly in my light. The floor was relatively flat, composed of packed earth and small stones. And there, in the center of the chamber, was a woman. She was facing away from me, her long dark hair hanging down her back in wet tangles. She wore what appeared to be a white nightgown, soaked and clinging to her slight frame. Her arms hung limply at her sides, her bare feet planted in the dirt. "Ma'am," I called, relief washing over me. "Are you hurt? I heard you calling for help." She didn't respond or turn around. I took a step closer, my light fixed on her still form. "I'm Jennifer," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and reassuring. "I'm camping nearby. Let me help you get somewhere warm." Slowly, the woman began to turn. As she did, my light revealed more details. Her nightgown was not just wet but filthy, covered in dark stains. Her hair wasn't just tangled but matted with mud and what looked like dried blood. And her skin, what I could see of her arms and feet, was unnaturally pale, almost blue-white. When she finally faced me, I staggered backward, a scream caught in my throat. Her face wasn't a face at all, just a smooth, featureless expanse of flesh where her features should have been. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, yet somehow I knew she was looking at me, aware of my presence. "Jennifer." The voice emanated not from the featureless face but from all around me, as if the cave itself were speaking. "You came. Everyone always comes when they hear the call." I turned to run, but the tunnel entrance was gone. Where it had been was now solid rock. I spun in a circle, my headlamp beam frantically searching for an exit, but the chamber was completely sealed. "Don't be afraid," the voice said, now directly behind me. "You're not the first to wander these woods alone. So many come to Mark Twain Forest seeking solitude. What they find is me." I whirled around. The woman, the thing, stood inches from me. This close, I could see that her flesh wasn't flesh at all, but a writhing mass of what looked like pale worms or maggots, constantly shifting and rearranging themselves into the approximate shape of a human. "What are you?" I whispered, backing away until I hit the wall of the chamber. "I am Eleanor Pruitt," the thing said. "Or I was, 100 years ago. Now I am hunger. I am the hollow under the hill. I am what waits for the lonely." My mind raced, trying to process what was happening. Was I hallucinating? Had I fallen and hit my head? Or was I truly face to face with something supernatural? "The clothes by the pond," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "They're yours." A sound like laughter echoed through the chamber. "A lure." The voice, the clothes, the footprints, all designed to bring you here. Humans are predictable. They hear a cry for help and they come running. So noble, so foolish. "What do you want from me?" I asked, though I feared I already knew the answer. "Company," Eleanor said. "It's lonely down here in the dark, but you'll join the others soon enough." As she spoke, I noticed movement in the shadows at the edges of the chamber. My headlamp revealed pale, humanoid figures emerging from crevices in the walls. Dozens of them, all with the same featureless faces, all composed of the same writhing, worm-like mass. "You see?" Eleanor's voice was almost gentle. "You'll never be alone again." The figures began to move toward me, slowly but with purpose. I pressed myself against the wall, searching desperately for a weapon, an escape route, anything. My hand closed around a loose rock, about the size of a softball. Without thinking, I hurled it at the nearest figure, watching in horror as it passed through the writhing mass, temporarily disrupting the human shape before it reformed. "Physical objects can't harm us," Eleanor said, now directly in front of me. "We exist between states, not fully material, not fully spirit. We are the in-between, the forgotten, the lost." A cold, wet sensation against my ankle made me look down. Tendrils of the same pale, worm-like substance that composed Eleanor were creeping across the floor toward me, beginning to wrap around my legs. In desperation, I reached for my backpack, fumbling for anything that might help. My hand closed around my fire starter kit. A crazy idea formed in my mind. If these things were composed of organic matter, perhaps they could burn. I flicked the ferro rod against the striker, creating a shower of sparks. The tendrils around my ankles recoiled immediately, retreating from the light and heat. Eleanor hissed, backing away. "Fire," she said, and for the first time, I heard fear in her voice. "The old enemy. It burns away the veil between worlds, forces us to choose, material or spirit. We cannot exist in its presence." I worked quickly, pulling out the emergency fire starter from my kit, a small block of magnesium with a flint edge. I scraped shavings from the block onto a piece of paper from my notebook, then struck the flint, sending a shower of sparks onto the pile. The magnesium caught immediately, burning with an intense, white-hot flame. The effect on the creatures was immediate and dramatic. They retreated to the edges of the chamber, their forms becoming less stable, parts of them dissolving into mist while other parts remained solid. "You can't escape." Eleanor's voice had changed, becoming deeper, more resonant, less human. "The tunnels go for miles. You'll get lost, wander in the dark until your light dies and your strength fails. And then we'll find you." I ignored her, focusing on creating a makeshift torch. I wrapped the burning paper around a stick from my pack, adding small twigs and strips of cloth to build the flame. The fire cast dancing shadows across the chamber, holding the creatures at bay but also revealing something I hadn't noticed before. A slight movement of air from a dark crevice to my right, suggesting another passage. With one hand holding the torch high and the other gripping my backpack, I made a dash for the crevice. The creatures didn't pursue me directly, but I could hear them moving through the rock around me, their voices whispering from the walls. "So many tunnels. Which will you choose? We know every passage, every turn. You'll tire before we do. The fire will die, but we are eternal." The crevice opened into another tunnel, this one natural rather than man-made, twisting and turning through the bedrock. I moved as quickly as I dared, ducking under low sections, squeezing through tight spots, always heading in the direction where the air felt freshest. I lost track of time as I navigated the labyrinth. My torch began to sputter, the flame shrinking as it consumed the last of its fuel. The voices continued to follow me, sometimes distant, sometimes so close they seemed to be right beside my ear. Just as my torch threatened to go out completely, the tunnel ahead lightened. I hurried forward, hope surging, and found myself facing a narrow vertical shaft with roots hanging down from above. Looking up, I could see a faint glow, moonlight filtering through what must be an opening to the surface. The shaft was about 15 feet high, its walls rough enough to climb but challenging in my exhausted state. I extinguished what remained of my torch. I would need both hands free, and began to climb, using roots and rock protrusions as handholds. Halfway up, I heard movement below. Glancing down, I saw pale forms flowing into the base of the shaft, beginning to climb the walls with inhuman speed. I scrambled upward with renewed desperation, ignoring the pain as rocks cut into my palms and my muscles screamed in protest. I reached the top just as cold, wet tendrils wrapped around my ankle. Looking down, I saw Eleanor's faceless form directly below me, her substance stretching upward to entangle my leg. Beyond her, the shaft was now filled with writhing, pale figures, all reaching for me. The opening was partially blocked by tree roots and packed earth. I clawed at it frantically, tearing away handfuls of soil and snapping roots until the hole was large enough to squeeze through. As I pulled myself up, the tendrils around my ankle tightened painfully, trying to drag me back down. In a final, desperate move, I pulled out my lighter and flicked it to life, touching the flame to the substance wrapped around my leg. It recoiled with a sound like steam escaping from a kettle, releasing me instantly. I scrambled through the opening, collapsing onto the forest floor above. I lay there for several minutes, gasping for breath, staring up at the night sky visible through the trees. The moon was high. I'd been in those tunnels for hours. Finally, I sat up and looked around, trying to figure out where I was. I had emerged in a dense part of the forest with no trail in sight. The hole I'd climbed out of was at the base of a massive oak tree, its gnarled roots forming a natural cage over the opening. Without my desperate excavation, I never would have noticed it was there. Using the moon and stars to orient myself, I began making my way back in what I hoped was the direction of my campsite. My headlamp still worked, thankfully, though the battery was running low after being on for so long. After about an hour of difficult navigation through the dense underbrush, I spotted the welcome glow of my campfire in the distance, somehow still burning, though it had died down to embers. My tent stood undisturbed, everything exactly as I'd left it. I collapsed beside the fire, feeding it fresh wood until it blazed brightly again. Only then, in the safety of its light, did I examine my injuries. My hands were cut and bleeding from the climb, my ankle bruised where those tendrils had gripped it, my clothes torn and filthy, but I was alive. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't bring myself to enter the darkness of my tent, not with the memory of what lurked beneath the forest floor still fresh in my mind. Instead, I kept the fire burning high and bright, starting at every sound from the surrounding woods. When dawn finally broke, I packed up my gear with trembling hands and began hiking out, abandoning my planned route in favor of the shortest path back to civilization. I didn't care about my feature article anymore. I just wanted to get away from Mark Twain National Forest and whatever lived beneath it. It took me most of the day to reach my car, parked at a trailhead near the town of Winona. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror at the wall of trees receding behind me. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest, a woman in a white nightgown, her long, dark hair hanging limply around a face I couldn't quite make out. Then I blinked, and she was gone. I never filed my article about people seeking solitude in nature. How could I, when I now understood the terrible truth? Sometimes, when we go looking for solitude, we find things waiting in the darkness, things that have been alone for far too long and crave company of their own. 3 weeks after my escape, I was researching in the archives of the Post-Dispatch when I found it, a small article from 1923 about the disappearance of a young woman named Eleanor Pruitt from her family's homestead near what is now the Mark Twain National Forest. The article mentioned that Eleanor had been known locally as odd and solitary, often wandering alone in the woods for days at a time. After her disappearance, searchers found some of her clothes neatly folded beside a small pond, but Eleanor herself was never seen again. At the bottom of the article was a photo, grainy and faded with age but clear enough to see the young woman's face. She had long dark hair and sad eyes, but it was her slight smile that sent chills down my spine. It was a knowing smile, as if she understood something that the photographer did not. I recognized that smile. I'd seen it forming on a featureless face composed of writhing, pale worms deep beneath the forest floor. I still have nightmares about the tunnels, about the pale figures reaching for me, about Eleanor's voice echoing from the walls. "You'll never be alone again." Sometimes I wake up in the night, certain that I can hear her calling my name, beckoning me back to the hollow under the hill. And sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment, I catch myself listening for that voice, feeling an inexplicable pull toward the wilderness I fled. Because the most terrifying truth is this: part of me wants to answer that call, to return to the darkness where Eleanor waits, to never be alone again. That's why I've moved to Chicago now, surrounded myself with the noise and light of the city, far from any forests or caves or hollow hills. That's why I keep every light in my apartment burning through the night, because I know what waits in the darkness. I know what calls to the lonely, and I'm afraid that someday I might answer. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the Mark Twain National Forest, Missouri, last fall. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful kind that draws people to places like this, but a void, an absence so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums. Even the crisp autumn leaves beneath my boots made no sound as I trudged deeper into the forest. I'd chosen the Irish Wilderness area in the southeastern part of Mark Twain National Forest specifically because it was remote. After Julie left, taking half our life together and all my self-worth, I needed somewhere I could scream without anyone hearing me. The irony wasn't lost on me that now, 3 days into my solo hiking trip, I couldn't even hear myself. My original plan was to follow the Whites Creek Trail for its full 11-mile loop before setting up at Fiddler Spring for the night. I'd read about the spring online, how locals claimed the water had healing properties. Not that I believed in such things, but desperation has a way of making fools of us all. The trail map showed the spring was nestled in a valley between 2 ridges, with a small creek running alongside. But what the map didn't show was how the forest would change as I approached. The towering oaks and hickories that had kept me company for miles began to thin, replaced by twisted, stunted trees I couldn't name. Their branches reached toward each other across the trail, creating archways that seemed to pull me forward. I checked my phone. No signal, as expected. The GPS was still working, though, positioning me about half a mile from the spring. The screen flickered, then went black. When it came back on, the map showed I was now 3 miles away, in the opposite direction. "Piece of junk," I muttered, shoving the phone back into my pocket. I'd been following the trail markers, bright yellow blazes on tree trunks, and they hadn't led me astray yet, until they did. The last marker I saw was different. Not the standard yellow blaze, but something that looked hand-carved into the bark. A crude stick figure with elongated limbs. I paused, wondering if some kid had defaced the official markers, when I noticed how quiet it had become. That's when the silence hit me. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of wind through leaves, just the labored rhythm of my own breath and heartbeat. I checked my watch. 3:42 p.m. Plenty of daylight left, but the forest had darkened considerably. The canopy above had grown denser somehow, filtering out all but the most determined rays of sunlight. Those that made it through created dappled patterns on the forest floor that seemed to shift and move even when there was no breeze. "Keep it together, Mike," I said aloud, just to hear something. My voice sounded wrong, flat and muffled, as if the air itself was swallowing the sound. I decided to push forward. According to my now useless GPS, the spring couldn't be far, and I needed water. My 2 liters had dwindled to less than half a bottle, and the day had been unseasonably warm for October. The trail began to slope downward, which aligned with what I remembered about the spring being in a valley. small victories. I followed the decline, relieved to have some sense of direction. The path narrowed, hugged by increasingly dense underbrush that clawed at my pants and exposed arms. Small scratches began to sting as sweat seeped into them. An hour later, I still hadn't found the spring. The trail had widened into a small clearing, and I decided to make camp. It wasn't ideal, too exposed, but the thought of continuing as darkness fell seemed worse. I set up my tent, gathered some wood for a fire, and tried to shake the growing unease that had settled over me. The fire wouldn't start. No matter how I arranged the kindling, how carefully I built the structure, the flames would catch momentarily, then die, leaving nothing but a thin, acrid smoke that seemed to hang motionless in the air. With daylight fading fast, I gave up on the fire and retreated to my tent with a protein bar and the last of my water. Tomorrow, I'd find that damn spring, refill my bottles, and head straight back to the trailhead. This solo wilderness therapy was clearly doing more harm than good. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of being watched. In one, I was standing at the edge of a circular clearing. In the center was a stone well, ancient and crumbling. A figure stood on the opposite side, its form obscured by mist. It raised a hand in greeting, and I found myself walking toward it, though every instinct screamed at me to run. When I was halfway across, the ground beneath me gave way, and I was falling into darkness. I woke with a gasp, my sleeping bag soaked with sweat. The tent was pitch black, but something felt wrong. I fumbled for my headlamp and switched it on. My breath caught in my throat. The interior of my tent was covered in thousands of tiny black spiders. They carpeted the walls, the ceiling, even my sleeping bag. I thrashed wildly, a scream building in my chest but dying before it reached my lips. And then they were gone. Just gone. Not scurrying away or falling, simply there one moment and not the next. I sat frozen, the beam of my headlamp sweeping frantically across every surface. Nothing. Not a single spider remained. Had I dreamed it? Was I losing my mind? I checked my watch. 3:17 a.m. Hours until dawn. A sound broke the silence, the first I'd heard since the forest went quiet. A soft, rhythmic tapping on the ground outside my tent, like footsteps, but not quite. Too irregular, too deliberate. Tap, 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 tap. I held my breath, listening intently. The tapping continued, then stopped abruptly. Something brushed against the outside of my tent, a light touch that traveled from one side to the other. "Hello," I called out, my voice cracking. "Is someone there?" No response, just the pressing silence and the sense that something was waiting just beyond the thin nylon walls. I didn't sleep again that night. Dawn came reluctantly, as if the sun itself was hesitant to illuminate what lurked in these woods. I packed up quickly, eager to be moving. My water was gone, forcing me to find the spring before heading back. As I dismantled my tent, I noticed something strange on the ground where the tapping had come from. A perfect circle of mushrooms that hadn't been there when I made camp. Inside the circle, the grass was withered and black. A fairy ring. I remembered reading about them as a kid, supposedly doorways to the realm of the Fae. Bad luck to step inside one. I shook my head at my own superstition. Lack of water was making me delirious. I shouldered my pack and consulted my compass. North would eventually lead me to the main trail. I set off, cutting through the woods rather than following the vanishing path I'd been on. The forest felt different in daylight, less oppressive but somehow more watchful. Every so often, movement at the corner of my vision would draw my attention, but when I turned to look, there was nothing but trees and shadows. After an hour of hiking, thirst became my primary concern. My mouth was dry, my lips cracked. When I came across a small stream cutting through the forest floor, I nearly wept with relief. The water was crystal clear, flowing over smooth stones that glinted in the patches of sunlight. I knelt beside it, pulling out my filter bottle, As I dipped it into the stream, the water around it turned red. Blood red. I yanked my hand back with a curse. The stream ran clear again. I blinked hard, wondering if dehydration was causing me to hallucinate. Cautiously, I touched a finger to the water, cool and clear. I filled my bottle, filtered it, and drank deeply. The water tasted sweet, almost too sweet, but I was too thirsty to care. Refreshed, I continued north, hoping to find the main trail before midday. The trees thinned slightly, allowing more light to reach the forest floor. My spirits lifted with each step that took me closer to civilization. Then I saw the cabin. It stood in a small clearing, weathered gray boards sagging under the weight of age and neglect. No smoke rose from the stone chimney, no sign of habitation visible from where I stood at the edge of the trees. But something about it called to me, a promise of shelter, perhaps even directions. Approaching cautiously, I noted details that seemed off. The windows were intact but darkened, as if the glass itself absorbed light rather than reflected it. The front door hung slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. "Hello," I called out, stopping several yards from the porch. "Anyone home?" Wind suddenly rushed through the clearing, causing the door to swing open fully with a groan of rusty hinges. An invitation, or a trap. Common sense told me to keep walking, to leave this derelict structure and its secrets behind. But thirst and curiosity, a deadly combination, drew me forward. The interior of the cabin was a single room, surprisingly clean given its external appearance. A table and chair sat in one corner, a small wood stove in another. A narrow bed lined the far wall, neatly made with a patchwork quilt. Everything covered in a fine layer of dust, undisturbed for what seemed like years, except for the book. Open on the table, its pages crisp and white against the weathered wood. I approached, drawn by the incongruity of its newness in this forgotten place. The pages were covered in handwriting, tight, meticulous script that filled every inch of available space. I leaned closer, trying to make sense of the words. They come from the hollow. Always at night, tapping first, then whispering. Don't listen to what they promise. Don't follow when they call your name. A chill ran down my spine despite the warmth of the cabin. I flipped back a page. Day 47. Found another fairy ring today, bigger than the others. The spring is contaminated now. Water runs clear but tastes sweet. Too sweet. Those who drink become compliant, easier to lead away. I swallowed hard, the sweet aftertaste of the stream water suddenly cloying in my mouth. Day 53. They took Sarah last night. She said she heard singing from the hollow, went to investigate while I slept. Found only her shoes at the edge of the largest ring. Sheriff says she probably left on her own. Says I'm paranoid. Says there's nothing in these woods that would hurt anyone. He's wrong. The next several pages detailed the writer's investigations, maps of fairy ring locations, descriptions of strange sounds and sightings, theories about what lived in a place called the Hollow. Day 71. I found it. The Hollow, a sinkhole at the base of the northern ridge. Things live inside, not animals, not human. They wear faces when they need to. Sarah's face. Others too. They're getting bolder, coming closer to the cabin each night. Day 72. They want something from me, not my body, something else. They whisper about my essence, whatever that means. I've boarded the windows, lined the doors with iron nails. They hate iron. The final entry sent ice through my veins. They're here, inside somehow. They look like spiders at first, thousands of them. Then they change, become what you fear most. The entry ended mid-sentence, a long ink streak trailing off the page as if the writer had been interrupted, or taken. I stepped back from the table, suddenly aware of how quiet the cabin had become. Not even the sound of my breathing disturbed the stillness. Something moved in the corner of my vision, a shadow detaching itself from the wall. I spun to face it, but there was nothing. When I turned back to the table, the book was gone. Panic surged through me. I rushed for the door, yanking it open and bursting outside into the clearing. It wasn't the same clearing. Where there had been sunshine and open sky before, now there was only the dense canopy of ancient trees, blocking all but the faintest light. The cabin behind me looked different too. Older, more decrepit, the roof partially collapsed. I had entered one cabin and exited another, or the same cabin in a different time. Neither option made sense, yet the evidence was before my eyes. My watch read 6:17 p.m. Impossible. It had been barely noon when I found the cabin. I'd been inside for maybe 15 minutes. A sound reached me then. Water flowing over rocks. The spring. It had to be. And where there was a spring, there might be a trail, a way back to civilization. I followed the sound, pushing through underbrush that seemed to grab at my clothing with intentional malice. The trees pressed closer, their trunks twisted into unnatural shapes that vaguely resembled human forms caught in moments of agony. The ground sloped downward sharply, forcing me to half slide, half scramble down toward the sound of water. The underbrush gave way suddenly, and I stumbled into a perfectly circular clearing. In the center was a spring, water bubbling up from between moss-covered stones to form a small pool before flowing away as a stream. Around the pool was a ring of toadstools, their caps a sickly white that seemed to glow in the dimness. Fiddler Spring, I'd found it at last. But something was wrong. The water didn't flow outward in all directions as springs should. Instead, it vanished into a dark opening at the base of a limestone outcropping, a small cave or tunnel, the hollow. I knew I should turn back, find another way out of the forest. The warnings in the book were clear enough, but darkness was falling rapidly, and I had no idea which direction would lead me to safety. As I stood deliberating, voices drifted from the hollow, so faint I might have imagined them. Whispers at first, then clearer. A woman's voice calling my name. Michael. Michael Williams. No one knew I was here. No one knew my destination. No one should know my name. Help me, Michael. I'm lost. The voice was familiar somehow, tugging at memories I couldn't quite grasp. Julie, I whispered, the name escaping before I could stop it. Laughter echoed from the hollow. Julie's laughter, the kind that used to make me feel like the funniest man alive. But distorted now, stretched too thin, with something else beneath it. Come find me, Michael. I've been waiting for you. My feet moved without conscious command, carrying me toward the hollow. The fairy ring around the spring seemed to widen as I approached, making room for me to pass without stepping inside it. At the entrance to the hollow, I hesitated. Darkness waited beyond, absolute and impenetrable. No light, no sound now that the voice had gone quiet. I switched on my headlamp. The beam traveled perhaps 3 feet before being swallowed by the darkness. Julie, I called, my voice echoing strangely. Are you in there? A figure appeared at the edge of my light's reach, Julie's silhouette, hand extended toward me. I found something amazing. Michael, you have to see. She stepped back, retreating into the darkness. I followed. The tunnel narrowed quickly, forcing me to crouch and then crawl. The walls were slick with moisture, the air heavy with the scent of decay and something else, something sweet and cloying that made my head swim. The passage opened suddenly into a vast chamber, so large my light couldn't reach the other side. The ceiling soared upward, lost in shadow. The ground beneath me was soft, yielding under my weight. My light revealed the horror beneath my feet, a writhing mass of black spiders covering every inch of the chamber floor. I froze, a scream locked in my throat. Don't be afraid, Michael. Julie's voice came from everywhere at once. They're part of us now. A figure stepped into my light. Julie, but wrong. Her movements were jerky, her smile too wide. Her eyes reflected my light like an animal's, glowing green in the darkness. What happened to you? I whispered. "I've been freed," she said, her voice overlapping with others, masculine, feminine, young, old, all speaking in unison. "We all have. No more pain, no more loneliness." She extended her hand, and I saw that her fingers were too long, the joints bending in impossible directions. "Join us, Michael. We'll never leave you, never hurt you, never make you feel worthless." Other figures emerged from the darkness. Men and women of various ages, all with the same wrong movements, the same too wide smiles, the same reflecting eyes. Among them, I recognized the man from the missing hiker posters I'd seen at the trailhead, and a woman who might have been Sarah from the journal. "This is where lost things come to be found," Julie said, taking another step toward me, "where broken things are made whole." The sweet scent grew stronger, clouding my thoughts. It would be so easy to give in, to join them, to belong. My hand began to rise, reaching for Julie's outstretched fingers. A single thought broke through the haze. The journal. Don't listen to what they promise. I stumbled backward, away from Julie and the others. "You're not her. You're not any of them." Julie's face contorted, the human pretense sliding away like melting wax. Beneath was something ancient and hungry, with too many eyes and a mouth that split her face from ear to ear. "We gave you a choice," said the thing that wasn't Julie, its voice now a chorus of dozens, all speaking in perfect unison. "Now we take." The spiders surged toward me, a black wave rising from the floor. I turned and ran, scrambling back through the narrow passage on hands and knees, the chittering mass close behind. The passage seemed longer returning, twisting in ways I didn't remember. Several times I hit dead ends, forced to backtrack as the spider horde drew closer. When I finally burst from the hollow's entrance, night had fallen completely. The fairy ring around the spring glowed with an eerie blue light, illuminating the clearing. I ran, not caring which direction, just away from the hollow and whatever lived inside it. Branches whipped my face, roots tried to trip me, but fear drove me onward. Behind me, I heard movement. Not the sound of pursuit, but of the forest itself shifting, changing, trying to lead me astray. Hours passed in desperate flight. My lungs burned, my legs threatened to give out, but I didn't dare stop. The moon provided just enough light to avoid trees, but little else. Twice I found myself back at the same lightning-struck oak, the forest somehow turning me in circles despite my best efforts. Dawn found me climbing a steep ridge, hoping height would give me some perspective, some sense of direction. When I reached the top, I nearly wept with relief. In the distance, perhaps 2 miles away, I could see a road cutting through the forest, a thin black line of civilization. But between me and that road lay the hollow. From this height, I could see its true nature, not just a small cave but an enormous sinkhole, hundreds of feet across. The forest around it was different, the trees twisted and wrong, growing in concentric circles with the hollow at the center. Movement caught my eye, figures emerging from the hollow, spreading out into the forest. Dozens of them, too far to see clearly but moving with that same wrong gait I'd seen in the chamber. They were hunting me. I had 2 choices: try to circle around the hollow, a journey of many miles through increasingly hostile forest, or go directly through past the spring, and hope speed would see me safely to the road. I chose speed. Descending the ridge, I kept the road in sight as much as possible. The forest seemed less oppressive in daylight, the twisted shapes among the trees visible now as merely odd-growing trunks and branches. Not human forms at all, just trees. I almost believed it. The spring appeared before me suddenly, as if the forest had shifted to place it in my path. The fairy ring still glowed faintly, even in daylight. The hollow's entrance gaped like an open mouth, waiting. I would have to skirt the edge of the clearing, keeping distance between myself and both the ring and the hollow. Simple enough. As I moved around the perimeter, a voice called from behind me. "Michael." Not Julie this time. A man's voice. Familiar. I turned. My father stood at the hollow's entrance. My father who had died when I was 12. He looked exactly as I remembered him, down to the flannel shirt he'd been wearing the last time I saw him. "Son," he said, his voice catching the way it did when he was trying not to cry. "I've missed you so much." Something in me broke at those words. How many times had I longed to hear them over the years? How many times had I imagined one more conversation, one more chance to say all the things left unsaid? "You're not him," I said, my voice steady despite the tears threatening. "I am," he insisted, stepping forward. "I found my way here after what happened. Others come here when they're lost, or when they lose themselves." He looked at me meaningfully. "Like you, son. You've been lost for so long." "Stop it," I hissed. "You're not my father." "Remember the cabin we built when you were 9? He continued as if I hadn't spoken. "Up at the lake? You hammered your thumb and tried so hard not to cry. I told you real men feel pain. They just channel it into something useful. Details only my father would know. Details I'd nearly forgotten myself." He extended his hand. "Come with me, Mikey. We can build something new together." My resolve wavered. What if it really was him? What if this place, this hollow, was something beyond my understanding? A place where the lost really did come to be found. But then I noticed his shadow. It stretched behind him, cast by the morning sun. But it wasn't a man's shadow. It was something enormous, with too many limbs, too many angles, something ancient and patient and hungry. "You're not him," I repeated, more firmly this time. My father would never ask me to follow him into darkness. The thing wearing my father's face snarled, the sound inhuman and filled with rage. Its form flickered, my father's features melting away to reveal glimpses of what lay beneath, something my mind couldn't or wouldn't process. I ran. Behind me, others emerged from the hollow. Julie, strangers wearing faces of people I'd known, all calling my name, all promising comfort, belonging, an end to pain. Their voices followed me through the trees, sometimes seeming to come from ahead rather than behind, trying to confuse me, to turn me around. But I kept the road in sight and ran toward it with everything I had left. When my feet finally hit asphalt, I nearly collapsed with relief. But I didn't stop running until I reached my car at the trailhead parking lot, fumbling with shaking hands to unlock it and throw myself inside. As I sped away, I glanced in my rearview mirror. A figure stood at the edge of the forest. Not Julie, not my father, but something that had shed all human pretense. It raised a hand in farewell, and I knew with terrible certainty that part of me remained in the hollow, that something else now sat behind my eyes, looking out at the world with newfound hunger. Sometimes, when I'm alone and it's very quiet, I hear tapping, soft and rhythmic. Tap, 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 tap. And I wonder how long before I answer its call and return to the hollow, to finally claim what's mine and join what waits there in the darkness beneath the Mark Twain National Forest. Sometimes I find black spiders in my bedroom, though I live now in a high-rise apartment in Chicago, 30 floors up. Sometimes I catch my reflection moving differently than I do, smiling when I'm not. Sometimes I wake to find fairy rings on my apartment carpet, perfect circles of white fungus that disappear when I blink. They're patient. They can wait. They have what matters most, a piece of my essence, enough to ensure I'll never truly escape. My name is Michael Williams, Michael, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the Mark Twain National Forest, Missouri last fall, but it isn't over. My name is Emma Morgan, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Mark Twain National Forest, Missouri last fall. I've always been the adventurous type. Growing up in suburban St. Louis, I'd spend every chance I got exploring the outdoors, much to my parents' dismay. The wilderness called to me. its vastness, its silence, its indifference to human existence. That's why, when my job as an environmental consultant became too suffocating with its endless meetings and fluorescent lighting, I decided to take a 2-week solo hiking trip through the Mark Twain National Forest. "You're insane," my best friend Tara had said when I told her my plans. "People don't just disappear into the woods alone for weeks." "Some people do," I'd replied, already mentally packing my gear. "Besides, I won't be completely alone. I'll have Rex." Rex was my 3-year-old German Shepherd, a loyal companion who loved the outdoors as much as I did. He'd been a rescue, found abandoned near Merrimack State Park with scars that told stories no one wanted to hear. The shelter had warned me he might have issues, but in the 2 years I'd had him, he'd proven to be nothing but gentle and protective. I'd done my research before setting out. The Mark Twain National Forest spans 1.5 million acres across southern Missouri, with the Ozark Highlands Trail cutting through dense woodland, limestone bluffs, and crystal-clear springs. I planned to hike a remote section near Marble Creek, known for its rugged terrain and relative isolation from the more tourist-friendly areas. "At least take a satellite phone," my father had insisted, pressing the device into my hand the night before my departure. "Cell service is non-existent out there." I'd taken it to appease him, though I secretly relished the thought of being unreachable, unplugged, free. The first 3 days were everything I'd hoped for. Rex and I fell into an easy rhythm, waking at dawn, hiking until mid-afternoon, then setting up camp while there was still plenty of daylight. The October air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of decaying leaves and pine. The forest was alive with the rustle of small creatures and the occasional call of birds. At night, I'd sit by my small campfire with Rex pressed against my side, listening to the symphony of insects and watching stars appear in the patches of sky visible through the canopy. On the 4th day, everything changed. We were following a lesser-used trail that wound along Marble Creek, heading toward Devil's Tollgate, a natural rock formation where the creek had carved a passage through an ancient limestone bluff. The map showed a small clearing nearby, perfect for camping. The day had started clear but turned overcast as the afternoon wore on, with a heaviness in the air that promised rain. As we approached the area, I noticed Rex's behavior shift. He began walking closer to me, his ears perked forward, occasionally emitting a low whine. I attributed it to the changing weather and continued on. The trail narrowed, hugging the creek on one side with a steep, rocky slope on the other. Rex suddenly stopped, hackles raised, and let out a growl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, scanning the trail ahead. That's when I noticed the silence. The forest, which had been alive with sound all day, had gone completely quiet. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of leaves in the breeze, just the soft gurgle of the creek and my own breathing. 20 feet ahead, something moved. At first, I thought it was a deer, a common enough sight in these woods. But as my eyes focused, I realized the shape was all wrong. It was hunched over the creek, its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. I froze, my hand instinctively tightening on Rex's collar. The figure straightened slowly, as if sensing our presence. Even from this distance, I could tell it was humanoid, but wrong. Its proportions were distorted, arms hanging too low, head cocked at an impossible angle. Rex's growl deepened, and the figure's head snapped in our direction with a sickening quickness. I couldn't make out its features clearly through the shadows and distance, but I felt its gaze lock onto us with predatory intensity. My body flooded with adrenaline, that primal fight-or-flight response screaming at me to run. But something kept me rooted to the spot, a mixture of fear and horrible fascination. The figure took a step toward us, moving with a lurching gait that suggested broken bones poorly healed. That was enough to break my paralysis. "Come on, Rex," I hissed, turning back the way we'd come. We didn't run. Somehow I knew running would be worse, but we moved quickly, putting distance between us and whatever I'd seen. Once we were around a bend in the trail and out of sight, I stopped to catch my breath and check my map. There was a ranger station marked about 5 miles back. 5 miles of backtracking, but it seemed safer than continuing forward. I looked down at Rex, who was still on high alert, eyes fixed on the trail behind us. "We're heading back, buddy. Something's not right." We'd gone less than half a mile when fat drops of rain began to fall, quickly becoming a downpour. The trail, already uneven with rocks and exposed roots, turned slick with mud. Progress slowed to a careful crawl as visibility decreased with the fading light and sheets of rain. That's when I heard it. A high, keening sound that cut through the drumming of rain on leaves. It wasn't quite human, wasn't quite animal. It raised goosebumps on my skin and made Rex whine anxiously. Just the wind, I told myself, but I knew it wasn't. The sound came again, closer this time. With the daylight rapidly disappearing and the rain showing no signs of letting up, I realized we wouldn't make it to the ranger station before dark. I needed to find shelter and set up camp. Just off the trail, I spotted a small overhang in the limestone bluff. Not quite a cave, but enough to provide some protection from the rain. I led Rex toward it, fighting the feeling that we were being watched. The overhang was deeper than it had appeared from the trail, extending about 15 feet into the rock face. The floor was relatively dry, and there was enough room for both of us to sit comfortably. I quickly set up my small tent just inside the entrance for added protection and privacy, using my headlamp to see. Rex wouldn't settle. He paced the small space, occasionally stopping to stare out into the darkness, a low rumble in his chest. "It's okay," I said, trying to convince myself as much as him. "We're safe here." I attempted to start a small fire using the driest wood I could find, but everything was too wet to catch. I'd have to make do with my camping stove for a hot meal. As I prepared a packet of freeze-dried stew, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen earlier. A hiker with an injury, perhaps, but that didn't explain the unnatural proportions or movement. A bear standing on its hind legs. But bears don't have that lankiness, that wrongness. I was pulled from my thoughts by Rex's sudden bark, sharp, alarmed. He was standing at the entrance to our shelter, rigid with tension. I switched off my headlamp and moved beside him, straining to see through the curtain of rain. At first, there was nothing but darkness. Then, a flicker of movement about 30 yards away. A figure was standing at the edge of the trees. Even through the downpour, I could make out its silhouette. The same unnaturally elongated limbs, the same tilted head. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. "Hey," I called out, my voice sounding thin against the rain. "Do you need help?" The figure remained motionless. "Hello?" I tried again, louder this time. With a movement too swift to follow, it was gone, melting back into the forest. Rex's growl subsided into anxious whining. I put my arm around him, feeling his heart racing as fast as my own. "It's gone now," I whispered, wishing I believed it. Sleep was impossible. I sat with my back against the rock wall. Rex curled against me, jumping at every sound. The rain continued its relentless assault, and the darkness seemed to press in on our small haven like a living thing. Sometime in the early hours, the rain finally stopped. The silence that followed was almost more unnerving than the storm had been. I must have dozed off despite my fear, because I jerked awake to Rex's frantic barking. Dawn was breaking, casting a gray light over the wet forest. Rex was at the entrance again, fur bristling, teeth bared. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding. Just outside our shelter, arranged in a perfect semicircle, were dozens of small stones stacked in towers 3 or 4 high. They hadn't been there when we'd taken shelter. A cold dread washed over me. Someone, or something, had been here while we slept, close enough to arrange these totems without waking us. I quickly packed up our camp, my hands shaking. We needed to get to the ranger station, to civilization, to safety. As we stepped back onto the trail, Rex suddenly darted forward, barking at something in the underbrush. Before I could call him back, he disappeared into the thick vegetation. "Rex!" I shouted, fear clenching my chest. "Rex, come back!" His barking grew distant, then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. I dropped my pack and pushed through the wet foliage, calling his name over and over. Branches clawed at my face and arms, but I barely noticed, consumed by panic. I emerged into a small clearing and froze. In the center stood a crude structure, a teepee-like arrangement of branches and vines. Hanging from it were small animal carcasses in various states of decay, their bodies twisted into unnatural positions. The ground around it was covered in symbols scratched into the dirt, spirals and angular shapes that hurt my eyes to look at. But what made my blood run cold was the fresh blood dripping from one empty hook. "Rex," I whispered, my voice breaking. A low whine answered me, and I nearly collapsed with relief. Rex emerged from behind the structure, tail tucked between his legs, ears flattened against his head. There was no blood on him, no visible injury, but his eyes were wide with fear. I rushed to him, checking him over, murmuring reassurances I didn't feel. As I held him close, movement at the edge of the clearing caught my eye. A man stood there, an ordinary-looking man with gray-streaked hair and weathered skin, dressed in worn hiking clothes. He might have been in his 60s, with a lean build and the kind of deepened tan that comes from years outdoors. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice rough as if rarely used. Relief flooded through me at the sight of another human. "Thank God," I said. "I think there's something in these woods, something dangerous." The man's expression didn't change. "Yes," he agreed. "You." A chill ran down my spine. "What?" "You're trespassing," he said flatly. "This is hollow ground, sacred ground." I slowly stood, keeping a hand on Rex's collar. "I'm sorry, I didn't know. I'm just hiking through to Devil's Tollgate." The man shook his head. "No one just hikes through this part of the forest. Not anymore. Not since the Hollow took it back." "The Hollow?" I asked, a knot forming in my stomach. "The spirit of these woods," he said, making a gesture with his hand that resembled the symbols on the ground. "The old ones knew not to disturb it. They left offerings, respected its hunger." I took a step back, pulling Rex with me. "Look, I don't want any trouble. I'll leave, take another trail." The man smiled, revealing teeth filed to points. "Too late for that. It's already caught your scent." I ran, dragging Rex with me, crashing through the underbrush back toward the trail. I could hear the man laughing behind us, a sound that dissolved into that same inhuman keening I'd heard during the storm. When we reached the trail, I snatched up my abandoned pack and kept running, no longer caring about direction, just desperate to put distance between us and that clearing, that man, that laughter. We ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out. Only then did I stop, bending over with hands on knees, gasping for breath. Rex was panting heavily beside me, his eyes still wild with fear. Once I could breathe again, I pulled out my map with trembling hands. I needed to figure out where we were, how to get to safety. But as I studied it, my confusion grew. Nothing matched. The landmarks I could see, a distinctive rock formation, the curve of the creek, weren't where they should be according to the map. It was as if the forest had rearranged itself around us. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced it down. I needed to think clearly. The sun was still low in the east, which meant we'd been running roughly southward. If I continued in that direction, I should eventually hit a main trail or a forest road. I checked my compass to confirm our direction, but the needle spun wildly, never settling on a heading. With shaking hands, I reached for the satellite phone my father had insisted I bring, dead. No amount of button pressing or battery checking would bring it to life. "Okay," I said aloud, trying to keep the tremor from my voice. "We keep moving south. We follow the creek downstream. Water always leads to civilization." Rex stayed close as we walked, no longer ranging ahead as he had in the first days of our hike. The forest around us felt different now. The trees seemed closer together, their branches reaching like arthritic fingers. The usual woodland sounds had returned, but they were somehow off-key, discordant. Hours passed. The creek we were following widened, its clear water turning murky. The terrain became increasingly difficult. Steep embankments, fallen trees, sections where we had to wade through shallow water because there was no passable bank. By mid-afternoon, I was exhausted, hungry, and increasingly certain we were walking in circles. Landmarks began to look familiar, though I knew we hadn't passed them before. At one point, I swore I saw the same distinctive bent tree 3 times from different angles, though we'd been walking in a straight line. As dusk approached, I knew we needed to find shelter for the night. The thought of being in these woods after dark filled me with dread, but I had little choice. We came upon a small cabin nestled against a hillside, its weathered wood blending almost seamlessly with the surrounding trees. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, suggesting occupation. I hesitated. After my encounter with the man in the clearing, I was wary of the forest's inhabitants, but night was falling fast, and the temperature was dropping. I needed help, or at least information. "Hello?" I called as we approached. "Is anyone there?" The cabin door creaked open, and a woman stepped out onto the small porch. She was small and wiry, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her face was a map of wrinkles, but her eyes were sharp and clear. "You're lost," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, relief weakening my knees. "Yes, I'm trying to get back to the main trail or a ranger station, anywhere I can find help." The woman studied me, then Rex, her expression inscrutable. After a long moment, she stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in before dark falls. It's not safe out there now." I hesitated, only briefly, before climbing the steps to the porch. The cabin's interior was a single room, sparsely furnished but meticulously clean. A fire burned in the stone hearth, and bundles of dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams. The walls were lined with shelves holding jars of unidentifiable contents and what looked like animal bones. "Sit," the woman said, gesturing to a wooden chair near the fire. "The dog can stay by the door." I sat, grateful for the warmth, though unease still prickled along my spine. "Thank you. I'm Emma. This is Rex." The woman nodded but didn't offer her own name. She moved to a small stove in the corner and poured something from a pot into a mug. "Drink this," she said, handing it to me. "It will restore your strength." The liquid was dark and smelled of earth and roots. I took a small sip, finding it bitter but not unpleasant. Warmth spread through my body immediately. "You've disturbed the hollow," she said abruptly. I nearly choked on my second sip. "The man in the woods mentioned that too. What is it?" The woman sat across from me, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "Not what? Who? The hollow is what remains of someone who loved these woods too much to leave them." "I don't understand." "Joseph Hollow was a trapper who lived in these parts in the 1830s, she explained, her voice taking on a rhythmic quality like she was reciting something memorized long ago. "When settlers began clearing the forest for farms, he fought them, killed some. They hunted him down, hanged him from an oak tree, and left his body to rot." I shivered despite the fire's warmth. "But Hollow had made a pact with the forest," she continued. "His spirit remained, bound to the trees, the rocks, the water. Over time, he became something else, something hungry." "For what?" I whispered, though I feared I knew the answer. "The lives he was denied, the years stolen from him." Her eyes locked with mine. "He takes different forms. Sometimes an animal, sometimes a traveler like yourself, sometimes just a shadow between the trees, but always hunting." Rex whined from his spot by the door, and I noticed he was trembling. "The stones," I said suddenly. "The stacked stones outside our shelter last night." "His markers," the woman nodded. "He's claimed you." Fear closed my throat. What do I do? Few escape once he's marked them. But there is a way. She rose and moved to the shelves, selecting several jars and a small cloth pouch. You must reach Devil's Tollgate by sunrise. The boundary of his territory runs through it. If you pass through while carrying these, you might be safe. She pressed the pouch into my hand. It was heavier than its size suggested, and I could feel hard objects inside. Inside are graveyard dirt, iron nails, and sage, she explained. Hollow hates them all. They'll slow him, confuse him. But you must hurry. Night has already fallen. As if to emphasize her point, something scraped against the cabin's outer wall, a sound like claws on wood. The woman's expression tightened. He knows you're here. You must go. Now. Through the back. Take the path down to the creek, then follow it. Don't look back no matter what you hear. Come with me, I pleaded. It's not safe for you either. She smiled, a sad thing that didn't reach her eyes. I've been safe from Hollow for 60 years. This cabin stands on consecrated ground. He cannot enter. She pressed a crude map drawn on a piece of bark into my hand. Devil's Tollgate is 3 miles east. Run, girl, and pray. I clipped Rex's leash to his collar, clutching the pouch and map like lifelines. The woman opened a small door at the back of the cabin that I hadn't noticed before. Remember, she said as we slipped out into the darkness, don't look back. The night was moonless. The forest a wall of impenetrable shadow beyond the small circle of light from the cabin. I switched on my headlamp, its beam seeming feeble against the darkness. The path was narrow but clear, winding down a steep slope toward the sound of rushing water. We hadn't gone more than 50 yards when an inhuman scream split the night. A sound of rage and hunger that made my blood freeze. It had come from the direction of the cabin. I almost turned back, almost broke the woman's rule, but Rex tugged urgently at his leash, pulling me forward. I followed, forcing myself to focus on the path ahead. The creek was wider here, its water black in the darkness. According to the bark map, we needed to follow it downstream to reach Devil's Tollgate. I stepped carefully along the rocky bank, Rex pressed against my leg. Another scream rang out, closer this time. I quickened my pace, stumbling over rocks and roots. The forest around us came alive with sounds, branches breaking, undergrowth rustling, and a rhythmic thudding like heavy footfalls. The sounds seemed to come from all directions at once, surrounding us. Something moved in the periphery of my headlamp's beam. A flash of pale skin, gone before I could focus on it. Rex growled, hackles raised. "Keep going," I whispered, though whether to Rex or myself, I wasn't sure. We half ran, half scrambled along the creek bank. I pulled out the pouch the woman had given me and clutched it tightly, hoping it would offer some protection. The sounds grew closer. Breathing, harsh, wet breathing, just behind us. I didn't look back, couldn't look back. My foot caught on an exposed root and I went down hard, skinning my palms on the rocky ground. Rex tugged at his leash, urging me up. As I pushed myself to my knees, my headlamp illuminated something in the water. A face, pale, distorted, with hollow eye sockets and a mouth stretched impossibly wide, stared up at me from just beneath the surface. I screamed, scrambling backward. The face moved with me, staying directly beneath me as if it weren't in the water at all, but a reflection of something above. I looked up. Hanging from a branch not 10 feet overhead was a figure, twisted, elongated, its joints bent at impossible angles. It clung to the tree like an insect, head rotated completely around to stare down at me with that same hollow-eyed face. Joseph Hollow. Rex erupted into frenzied barking, lunging at the tree. The creature's mouth opened wider than any human mouth could, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. It began to uncurl from the branch, its movements fluid yet jerky, like stop-motion animation. I fumbled with the pouch, tearing it open. Inside were iron nails, just as the woman had said, along with what looked like dark soil and dried herbs. Without thinking, I threw a handful of the mixture up at the creature. It recoiled with a shriek, clawing at its face where the mixture had touched it. The skin seemed to bubble and smoke. I didn't wait to see more. I grabbed Rex's leash and ran, no longer caring about the path, just desperate to put distance between us and that thing. The forest blurred around us as we crashed through undergrowth, splashed across the creek, scrambled up embankments. The creature's screams pursued us, sometimes seeming far away, sometimes so close I could feel its breath on my neck. I used the mixture sparingly, throwing it behind us whenever the sounds grew too close. Each time, there was that same pained shriek, that momentary reprieve. My lungs burned, my legs trembled with exhaustion, but terror kept me moving. The bark map had long since been lost in our flight. I could only hope we were still heading toward Devil's Tollgate. As we crested a small rise, the trees thinned, and I caught a glimpse of towering rock formations ahead. The creek we'd been following disappeared into a narrow passage between two sheer limestone walls, a natural gateway that could only be Devil's Tollgate. Hope surged through me. We were close. If the woman was right, passing through that gateway would take us beyond Hollow's reach. A howl rose behind us, filled with rage and anticipation. The creature knew what we were trying to do. We half ran, half slid down the slope toward the gateway. The sky was beginning to lighten with the first hint of dawn, pale gray seeping into the black of night. We just needed to reach the gate before full sunrise. Something massive crashed through the trees behind us. I didn't look back, just ran harder, pulling Rex with me. The gateway loomed ahead, a slice of lighter darkness between towering walls of stone. 20 yards, 10. A searing pain lanced through my shoulder, spinning me around. I fell, pulling Rex down with me. Standing over us was Joseph Hollow in his most monstrous form yet, a skeletal giant with limbs like gnarled branches, its chest a hollow cavity in which small flames flickered. Its face was mostly skull now, with just enough flesh to form that terrible, wide mouth. One elongated hand gripped my shoulder, its fingers digging in like claws. The other reached for Rex, who snapped and snarled, trying to keep it at bay. With my free hand, I grabbed the last of the mixture from the pouch and flung it directly into the creature's face. It reared back with a howl of agony, releasing me to claw at its bubbling flesh. I scrambled to my feet, yanking Rex's leash, and made a final desperate dash for the gateway. The creature recovered too quickly. I felt it behind us, gaining with each stride. Its ragged breathing filled my ears. The first true ray of sunlight broke over the eastern horizon just as we reached the gateway. It illuminated the passage between the rock walls, turning the limestone golden. I threw myself forward, pulling Rex with me. Something caught the back of my jacket, jerking me to a halt. I was yanked backward, my feet leaving the ground. Rex yelped as his leash was torn from my grip. I was spun around to face Joseph Hollow, its skull face inches from mine. Up close, I could see the remains of the man he had once been. Fragments of human features frozen in an eternal rictus of rage. The hollow cavity of its chest pulsed with those strange flames, and I realized with horror that they were the spirits of those it had taken, their faces briefly forming in the fire before dissolving back into light. "Mine," it hissed, its voice like dry leaves scraping stone. "Mine to take." The sun was rising quickly now, its light creeping down the rock walls toward us. The creature seemed to sense it, its movements becoming more urgent. Its jaw unhinged, opening wider and wider, revealing that impossible maw lined with hundreds of needle teeth. It bent toward my face, breath like the grave washing over me. A blur of fur and fury slammed into the creature's side, Rex, his teeth sinking deep into the wood-like flesh of its leg. The creature shrieked, its grip on me loosening just enough. I tore free, leaving a piece of my jacket in its clawed hand, and dove for the gateway. Rex followed, releasing his hold to run at my side. The creature lunged after us, its body elongating impossibly as it reached through the gateway. But as its arm crossed the threshold into the full sunlight now flooding the passage, something extraordinary happened. The limb began to splinter and crack, golden light pouring from the fissures. The creature howled in pain and rage, trying to withdraw, but it was too late. The sunlight seemed to be destroying it from within, those strange flames in its chest erupting outward, shattering its wooden skin. For a brief moment, I saw the spirits contained within break free, pale, human shapes that dispersed into the morning light with sighs of release. The creature that had been Joseph Hollow collapsed in on itself, crumbling to nothing but dust and twisted roots that the breeze quickly scattered. Rex and I stood on the other side of the gateway, trembling with exhaustion and residual terror. Behind us lay the sunlit trail, ahead the dark forest from which we'd escaped. I sank to my knees, pulling Rex close, burying my face in his fur. He whined softly, licking my tear-streaked cheeks. "We made it," I whispered. "We're safe." It took us most of that day to find our way back to civilization. We eventually stumbled upon a marked trail that led to a small visitor center at the edge of the Mark Twain National Forest. The rangers there were concerned by our appearance. Me, with a torn, bloodied jacket and wild eyes. Rex, limping slightly with a cut on his paw. I told them we'd gotten lost, that I'd fallen down a ravine. A simple, believable story that didn't include monsters or women in cabins that couldn't be found on any map. They brought us back to the ranger station, where I was checked over by an EMT while Rex was given water and treats. My father was called, and he drove down from St. Louis to collect us, his face pale with worry. I never told anyone the truth about what happened in those woods. Who would believe me? But I've never returned to Mark Twain National Forest, or any forest, for that matter. The wildness I once craved now fills me with dread. Sometimes, on dark nights when the wind moves through the trees outside my apartment, I think I hear that keening cry. And sometimes, in my dreams, I see Joseph Hollow's skull face and the spirits trapped in the flames of his hollow chest. Rex stays close on those nights as if he knows, as if he remembers. He growls at shadows that move oddly and barks at nothing I can see. The woman in the cabin told me I was safe once I crossed the boundary of Hollow's territory. But lately, I've been finding small towers of stacked stones on my balcony in the mornings. And I can't shake the feeling that territories can expand, that boundaries can be crossed from either direction, that hunger, once awakened, is never truly satisfied. My name is Emily Hall, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the Mark Twain National Forest, deep in the Ozarks of Missouri, just last autumn. I've always been drawn to solitude. After my divorce, that pull grew stronger, like the forest itself was calling me home. My therapist suggested I needed structured alone time to process everything. So when I saw the remote cabin listing near Marble Creek, it felt like fate. One woman, 1 week, just me and the ancient trees. No cell service, no distractions, no reminders of the life I was trying to leave behind. The drive from St. Louis took nearly 4 hours, the last stretch on gravel roads that twisted through dense woods like a serpent. The GPS started glitching about 20 miles from my destination, the robotic voice slowing and distorting until it finally died with an electric whine. I relied on the printed directions after that, though even they felt wrong somehow, distances stretching longer than indicated. The cabin was smaller than the photos suggested, weathered gray wood with a sagging porch and windows like vacant eyes. But it was mine for 7 days, and I was determined to make the most of it. The property manager, a gaunt man named Earl with nicotine-stained fingers, had left the key under a terracotta pot filled with cigarette butts. "Don't go wandering too far east," he told me over the phone. "That's Winchester Hollow. Folks get turned around in there." I'd laughed it off as local superstition. The Ozarks were full of such stories, warnings meant to keep tourists on marked trails and away from private property. I'd done my research, mapped out several-day hikes, and packed accordingly. I wasn't some amateur. The first night passed uneventfully. I built a fire in the stone hearth, finished half a bottle of wine, and fell asleep to the chorus of cicadas and distant owls. The darkness in the forest was complete. No streetlights, no passing cars, just an inky void beyond my windows that seemed to press against the glass. I woke before dawn, feeling inexplicably cold despite the mild September weather. My breath clouded in front of me, and the fire had died to gray ash hours ago. Through the window, I could see the tree line, black against the navy pre-dawn sky. Something moved there. A deer, I told myself. Just a deer. My first hike took me along Marble Creek, where clear water tumbled over smooth rocks. I followed a trail that wound alongside the creek, occasionally climbing up rocky bluffs that offered sweeping views of the forest canopy. The September leaves were just beginning to turn, splashes of crimson and gold among the green. I took photos, collected interesting rocks, identified birds from my pocket guide, normal things, safe things. It was on my return, about 2 miles from the cabin, when I first felt watched. The sensation hit suddenly, a crawling awareness on the back of my neck, goosebumps rising despite the afternoon warmth. I stopped, listening. The forest had gone silent. No birds, no insects, just the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze and my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. "Hello," I called, then immediately regretted it. My voice sounded thin and alien in the stillness. No response came, but when I turned to continue walking, I glimpsed movement in my peripheral vision. Something dark slipping behind a thick oak trunk, too tall for a deer, too quick to identify. I quickened my pace, repeatedly glancing over my shoulder but seeing nothing. By the time I reached the cabin, I was nearly running, my rational mind warring with primal instinct. I told myself it was a hiker, maybe a hunter, scouting before season opened. The alternative, that someone had followed me for miles through isolated woods, was too unsettling to consider. That night, the sounds outside changed. Instead of the natural symphony of the forest, I heard rhythmic tapping on the east-facing window. 3 quick taps, pause, 3 more, like a code, like a signal. I sat frozen in the armchair, staring at the dark rectangle of glass, waiting. The tapping came again, and I forced myself to approach. Heart pounding, I yanked the curtain aside. Nothing but darkness. I pressed my face to the cold glass, squinting into the night. At the edge of the tree line, something pale flickered. There and gone so quickly I couldn't be sure I'd seen it at all. Sleep eluded me that night. I lay in bed, ears straining at every creak and rustle. Around 3 a.m., I heard it. A soft, lilting humming outside, a woman's voice, singing a melody I almost recognized but couldn't place. I pulled the blanket over my head like a child hiding from monsters, and eventually drifted into uneasy dreams. The next morning, I found small footprints in the dirt beneath the east window. They were barefoot, with oddly elongated toes, and they approached the cabin from the woods before disappearing at the window. I told myself they were raccoon tracks distorted by the recent rain. I took photos to show Earl when I returned the key, thinking he might get a laugh out of my city girl jumpiness. Despite my unease, I set out that day for a longer hike to Crane Lake, about 4 miles northeast of the cabin. I left a note on the kitchen table detailing my planned route and expected return time, a habit from years of solo hiking. No one would see it, of course, but the routine was comforting. The trail to Crane Lake crossed several small streams and wound through increasingly dense forest. The map showed it clearly marked, but several times I found myself second-guessing, as trailblazes were faded or missing altogether. The forest felt different here. Older, the trees twisted into strange shapes, branches reaching like arthritic fingers. Moss hung in thick curtains, filtering the sunlight into a sickly green glow. I stopped at a fork not shown on my map, consulting my compass. East would lead me deeper into what must be Winchester Hollow. The rational choice was turning back, but something pulled at me, a compulsion I couldn't explain. I hesitated, then took the eastern path. The trail narrowed, sometimes disappearing altogether beneath thick blankets of fallen leaves. The trees grew closer together, their trunks black with moisture. Mushrooms sprouted in clusters at their bases, pale, fleshy things that looked too much like fingers pushing up from the soil. I walked for another half hour before accepting I was no longer on any marked trail. My compass was spinning uselessly, the needle rotating in slow circles rather than pointing north. A damp, clinging mist had risen from the ground, twining around my ankles like phantom hands. The temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees. That's when I saw the cabin. Not my rental. This was older, more decrepit, a true shack with a partially collapsed roof and a door hanging at an angle from rusted hinges. Gray smoke curled from a stone chimney, dissipating into the mist. I should have turned back. Everything in me screamed to retreat. Instead, I approached, drawn by a terrible curiosity and the growing certainty that I couldn't find my way back anyway. The forest had swallowed my breadcrumbs, rearranged itself behind me. "Hello?" I called. My voice startling crows from a nearby tree. They burst upward in a cacophony of harsh cries that sounded almost like laughter. The door of the shack creaked open. A woman stood silhouetted against the gloom within. She was small, hunched, her hair hanging in gray ropes around a face I couldn't clearly see. "Been waitin' on you, Emily," she said, her voice like rustling leaves. "Tea's getting cold." My blood froze. I'd told no one my name. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my mouth so dry the words caught in my throat. "Folks call me Mabel Winchester," she replied. "This was my hollow once upon a time. Still is, in the ways that matter." She stepped aside, gesturing for me to enter with a gnarled hand. Her fingernails were yellow and curved, too long for practical use, too long to be entirely human. "I should go," I said, taking a step backward. My husband is expecting me back." She made a sound like stones grinding together. It took me a moment to recognize it as laughter. "You ain't been married for some time now, girl. No one expecting you anywhere. No one even knows where you are." Her head tilted, bird-like. "Except me. I always know who's in my hollow." Fear rooted me to the spot. How could she know about my divorce? How could she know anything about me? "Come in or don't," she continued, turning back into the darkness of the shack. "But night falls quick in these woods, and you won't find your way back alone. Things walk after sunset that don't take kindly to trespassers." The rational part of me screamed to run, to try to retrace my steps before darkness fell. But the mist had thickened, obscuring the path I'd taken. The trees all looked identical now, a labyrinth of bark and branch. And somewhere in the distance I heard something moving. Heavy footsteps crushing undergrowth coming closer. I stepped into Mabel Winchester's shack. The interior was larger than the exterior suggested, which I attributed to my disorientation. A fire burned in a stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on walls hung with bundles of dried herbs and animal bones. A table and 2 chairs sat in the center of the single room, and on the table were 2 steaming cups. "Sit," Mabel instructed, lowering herself into one chair. The wood creaked beneath her, though she seemed to weigh almost nothing, her frame bird-boned beneath a shapeless dress of faded calico. I perched on the edge of the other chair, unwilling to take the tea. Up close I could see her face clearly, and wished I couldn't. Her skin was deeply creased, but not with ordinary wrinkles. The lines formed patterns, whorls and symbols that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Her eyes were milky white, pupilless, and yet I felt her gaze on me, inside me. "You've been running a long time," she said, sipping her tea. "From him, from yourself, from what you know is coming." My hands trembled. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The dreams," she said simply. "The ones where you're back in that house and the walls are bleeding, and no matter how many times you wash your hands, they stay red. The cup slipped from my grasp, shattering on the rough wooden floor. Tea splashed across my hiking boots. "How?" I began. "I know everyone who passes through my hollow," she repeated. "I see what haunts them. And something's been haunting you long before you came to these woods, Emily Hall." She wasn't wrong. The dreams had started 3 months after my divorce was finalized, a year after I'd left Richard. In them, I was always back in our colonial-style house in Clayton, standing in the kitchen where we'd had our final argument. In reality, that argument had ended with him throwing a glass that shattered against the wall near my head, and me packing a bag with shaking hands while he apologized, cried, threatened, cajoled. In the dreams, it ended differently. In the dreams, I picked up the largest shard of glass and, "I never hurt anyone," I whispered. "Didn't you?" Mabel's head tilted again, that unnatural angle. Dreams are just wishes we're afraid to make in the light. "No," I said firmly, standing. "I need to go. I need to get back to my cabin." "Run, if you like," she said, making no move to stop me. "But he's out there waiting. Has been since you arrived." "Who?" I demanded, fear making my voice sharp. "What you brought with you," she replied. "What followed you into my hollow? The thing wearing the face you dream about." I backed toward the door. "Richard is in St. Louis. We haven't spoken in over a year." Mabel's lipless mouth stretched into something approximating a smile. "I never said a name, did I? But you know who's waiting. Deep down you knew he'd find you eventually. Men like that always do." I fled, burst through the crooked door and into the gathering twilight, no longer caring which direction led home. The mist had grown thicker, twining around trees like ghostly serpents. The temperature had dropped further. My breath came in visible puffs as I crashed through underbrush, branches clawing at my face and arms. Behind me, Mabel Winchester's voice floated through the gloom. "Run all you want, girl. You brought him here. Only you can send him back." I ran until my lungs burned, until brambles had torn my jeans and blood trickled from a dozen scratches on my exposed skin. The light was fading fast, and with it, any hope of finding my way. My foot caught on an exposed root, sending me sprawling face first into the damp leaves. Pain shot through my ankle as I tried to stand, not broken, but sprained badly enough to limit my mobility. That's when I heard the footsteps again. Heavy, deliberate, coming closer. I dragged myself behind a massive fallen oak, trying to quiet my ragged breathing. The footsteps stopped. A voice called my name, a voice I hadn't heard outside my nightmares for over a year. "Emily? Honey, is that you?" Richard's voice, but wrong somehow. Too hollow, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "I've been so worried," the voice continued. "You shouldn't be out here alone. It's not safe." Tears streamed down my face as I pressed myself against the rotting wood of the fallen tree. This wasn't possible. He couldn't be here, couldn't have found me. "I know you're close," the voice said, a new edge creeping in, the familiar tone that preceded his explosions of rage. "I can smell your blood." The last words were distorted, deepening into something inhuman. I clapped a hand over my mouth to stifle a sob. Leaves crunched as whatever was out there moved closer, circling my hiding place. I could hear it breathing now. Wet, ragged sounds unlike any human respiration. "Remember the last thing I said to you, Em?" The voice was Richard's again, but underlaid with that wrongness. "I said if you left, I'd find you. I said there was nowhere you could go that I wouldn't follow. I meant it." A shadow fell over me. I looked up to see a figure looming on the other side of the fallen tree. A silhouette that was almost Richard's but elongated, the proportions subtly wrong. It was too dark to make out details, and for that I was grateful. "There you are," it said, and reached for me with arms that seemed too long, hands that ended in points rather than fingers. I screamed. The sound tore from my throat, primal and desperate. I scrambled backward, ignoring the pain in my ankle, throwing handfuls of leaves and dirt at the advancing shape. And then, impossibly, light bloomed in the forest. Warm, golden light that pushed back the shadows and illuminated my surroundings. The thing that wasn't Richard hissed, shrinking away from the glow. "Back to the hollow with you," came a gravelly voice, and Mabel Winchester emerged from between two twisted oaks, holding aloft a lantern that seemed to burn too brightly for its size. "This one ain't yours to take." The creature snarled, a sound no human throat could produce, and I caught a clearer glimpse of its face. It wore Richard's features like an ill-fitting mask. The skin stretched too tight over a skull that was the wrong shape, the mouth too wide and filled with needle-like teeth. "She's mine," it growled. "She's always been mine." "Ain't nothing and nobody belongs to you, Hollow Walker," Mabel replied, advancing with her lantern held high. "Especially not her. She freed herself from you once already." The creature backed away from the light, its form seeming to waver and distort. "You know what to do, girl," Mabel called to me, never taking her milky eyes off the retreating entity. "You've dreamed it enough times." My hand closed around a stone, sharp-edged and heavy. Without consciously deciding to, I rose to my feet, putting weight on my injured ankle without feeling the pain. "Richard," I said, and the creature's head snapped toward me, its distorted approximation of my ex-husband's face twisting into a grotesque parody of his smile. "You came back to me," it said, voice shifting between Richard's and something older, hungrier. "I knew you would." "No," I replied, stepping forward. "I never came back. I never will." The thing lunged, faster than I could react, but instead of reaching me, it slammed into an invisible barrier, recoiling as if struck. Mabel stood with one hand outstretched, muttering words I couldn't understand, her lips barely moving. "Now, girl," she shouted, "while I hold it." I didn't hesitate. I brought the stone down against the creature's temple with all the strength fear and adrenaline granted me. There was a sickening crunch, and the thing wearing Richard's face crumpled to the ground. I expected blood. Instead, the body began to curl in on itself, the skin blackening and peeling away like burnt paper, revealing nothing underneath but empty darkness that folded into itself until nothing remained but a scorch mark on the fallen leaves. My legs gave out, and I sank to the forest floor, shaking uncontrollably. Mabel approached, her lantern light now gentle, normal. "What was that?" I whispered. "It wasn't Richard. It couldn't have been." "Winchester Hollow draws out what haunts you," Mabel said, extending a gnarled hand to help me up. "Gives it form, gives it hunger. That thing was born from your fear, girl. Fed on it till it could walk and talk. But it's gone now." Mabel nodded, looking suddenly ancient and tired in the lamplight. "You sent it back to whatever darkness spawned it, faced your fear, and won." She paused, studying me with those unseeing eyes that somehow saw too much. Most don't. She helped me limp through the forest, the path now clearly visible in the lantern's glow. We walked in silence for what seemed like hours, but could only have been minutes before the trees thinned, and I saw my rental cabin in the distance, warm light spilling from its windows. "I don't understand," I said, turning to Mabel. "How did we get back so quickly? And who turned the lights on?" But I was speaking to empty air. Mabel Winchester had vanished, taking her lantern with her. Only the stone was still clutched in my hand, its edge stained with something too dark to be blood. I staggered to the cabin, my ankle throbbing with renewed pain. Inside, everything was exactly as I'd left it that morning, my coffee mug in the sink, my notebook open on the table. But the note I'd written detailing my hiking plans was gone. I spent that night with every light burning, jumping at each creak and rustle. But no tapping came at the windows. No humming drifted through the darkness. Whatever had been stalking me through Winchester Hollow was gone, or at least dormant. In the morning, I packed my things and left, 2 days earlier than planned. I stopped at the property manager's office in the small town of Centerville to return the key and ask about Mabel Winchester. Earl wasn't there. Instead, a young woman with tired eyes took my key, frowning when I asked about Winchester Hollow and its inhabitant. "Winchester," she repeated. "That family hasn't owned land around here for nearly a century. Old Mabel Winchester was the last of them. Story goes she was accused of witchcraft back in the 1920s, cursing men who mistreated their wives. Townsfolk burned her cabin with her inside." My blood ran cold. "That's horrible." The woman shrugged. "Just an old story. Though hikers sometimes say they've seen smoke from a chimney deep in that part of the forest where no cabin stands, or claim an old woman helped them when they got lost." She eyed me curiously. "You see something out there?" I thought of the creature wearing Richard's face, of Mabel's impossible cabin, of the stone still sitting in my pocket. "No," I lied, "just curious about local history." As I turned to leave, the woman called after me. "Those woods can play tricks on the mind, you know. Make you see what isn't there." She hesitated. "Or sometimes, what you need to see." I drove back to St. Louis that day, the events in Winchester Hollow already taking on the quality of a fever dream. But that night, for the first time in over a year, I slept without nightmares. The dreams of blood and broken glass never returned. Sometimes, when the anniversary of that trip approaches, I feel a tugging, a pull to return to the Ozarks, to Winchester Hollow, to see if Mabel's impossible cabin still stands in the mist, to thank her, perhaps, for showing me how to banish my own demons. But I resist the urge. Some hollows are best left unexplored, some debts best left unpaid, and some witches, I suspect, prefer their solitude as much as I've come to value mine. Still, I keep the stone, the one that destroyed the thing wearing Richard's face. I keep it on my nightstand, its dark stain never fading, just in case the hollow calls again and something answers. Just in case. My name is William Brown, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the Mark Twain National Forest near Tomsock Mountain, Missouri, 3 summers ago, but the memories still haunt me every night when I try to close my eyes. My girlfriend Rebecca Hill and I had been dating for almost 2 years. We both worked at the same tech company in St. Louis, long hours in air-conditioned offices staring at screens until our eyes burned. When Rebecca suggested a week-long hiking trip to reconnect with nature and each other, I agreed immediately. Neither of us were experienced hikers, but we were reasonably fit and eager for adventure. We spent weeks researching trails in the Mark Twain National Forest, plotting routes, buying equipment, and reading guides. We settled on a less-traveled section near the Tomsock Mountain State Park that promised stunning vistas and solitude. The plan was to hike a circular route over 5 days, camping at different spots each night. Looking back, I should have noticed how the park ranger's expression changed when we showed him our planned route. He hesitated just a moment too long before stamping our permit. "You folks be careful around the hollow," he said, his weathered face betraying no emotion. "Stay on marked trails, especially after dark." When I asked what the hollow was, he just shrugged. "Local name for a valley about 2 days in. Nothing to worry about if you stay on the path." Rebecca laughed it off as we walked to our car. "Classic horror movie setup," she joked. "Next he'll tell us about the ancient burial ground and the curse." I smiled, but something in the ranger's tone had unsettled me. Still, the sun was shining, we had all new gear to test out, and I was with the woman I loved. What could possibly go wrong? The first day was perfect, warm but not hot, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers. We hiked about 8 miles, taking frequent breaks to admire the scenery or identify birds using an app on Rebecca's phone. That night, we set up camp in a small clearing, built a fire, cooked freeze-dried pasta that tasted better than it had any right to, and fell asleep in our tent under a canopy of stars. The second day started much the same. By mid-afternoon, the trail began to descend into a wide, bowl-shaped depression in the landscape. This had to be the hollow the ranger mentioned. Even from the ridge, something about it seemed off. The trees grew denser, darker somehow, and the birdsong that had accompanied us all day seemed to fade into silence. "It's cooler down there," Rebecca said, mistaking my hesitation for concern about the heat. "Come on, we should reach our camping spot before sunset." As we descended into the hollow, the temperature dropped noticeably. The air became thick with moisture, carrying a faint musty odor like wet leaves and something else, something metallic. The path narrowed, forcing us to walk single file through increasingly dense undergrowth. "Will, look at this," Rebecca called, pointing to something just off the trail. It was a small cairn of stacked stones, with what appeared to be crude symbols carved into some of them. "Do you think hikers made these?" I examined the stones without touching them. The symbols didn't look like any trail markers I'd seen before. Jagged, asymmetrical patterns that seemed to crawl across the rock surfaces. "Let's keep moving," I said, suddenly eager to reach our campsite and get out of the hollow. Around 5 p.m., we arrived at Bell Mountain Creek, where we'd planned to camp. The spot should have been ideal, a flat area near a babbling stream. But as we set up our tent, I couldn't shake the feeling we were being observed. Every rustle in the undergrowth made me flinch. Rebecca noticed my unease. "City boy scared of the big bad woods?" she teased, hammering in the last tent stake. I forced a smile. Just tired and hungry. After dinner, as darkness settled around us, the forest came alive with sounds. Not the comforting white noise of insects and night birds we'd heard the previous evening, but irregular, discordant noises, scrabbling, chittering, and occasionally something that sounded almost like distant laughter. "That's just raccoons or possums," Rebecca said when I mentioned it, but I noticed she was speaking more softly than usual. We crawled into our tent early, exhausted from the day's hike. As I was drifting off to sleep, Rebecca suddenly grabbed my arm. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I listened. At first, there was only the ambient noise of the forest and the creek. Then I heard it, a sound like someone humming a tuneless melody, somewhere in the darkness beyond our campsite. "Probably just another camper," I whispered, not believing it for a second. We hadn't seen another soul on the trail all day. The humming stopped, then started again, closer this time. Rebecca's hand tightened on my arm. Then came a new sound, a rhythmic tapping like a stick against a tree trunk, keeping time with the humming. I fumbled for the flashlight and my pocket knife, heart pounding. "Hello?" I called out, instantly regretting breaking the silence. "Who's there?" The humming and tapping stopped abruptly. For several long seconds there was a total silence. No insects, no rustling leaves, nothing. Then something brushed against the side of our tent, so lightly it might have been a branch moved by the wind. Except there was no wind. Rebecca stifled a scream as a shadow passed over the tent fabric, something large moving between us and the dying embers of our campfire. I aimed the flashlight at the tent wall, but the shadow disappeared. Neither of us slept much that night. We lay rigid in our sleeping bags, listening to the strange noises that seemed to circle our campsite until the first gray light of dawn filtered through the trees. "We should head back," I suggested as we ate a cold breakfast, neither of us willing to leave the relative safety of our tent to restart the fire. Rebecca shook her head. "It was probably an animal, or maybe some locals messing with tourists. We're not quitting over some weird noises." I wanted to argue, but Rebecca had always been the strong one, the one who pushed through difficulties, and I didn't want her to think I was overreacting. So we packed up and continued deeper into the hollow, following our planned route. The third day brought fog, thick, clinging mist that reduced visibility to 20 feet in any direction and seemed to muffle all sound. The trail became increasingly difficult to follow, sometimes disappearing entirely among overgrown ferns and moss-covered rocks. By midday, I was certain we had strayed from the marked path despite our best efforts. "We should check the GPS," I suggested, reaching for my phone. No signal, of course. Rebecca's phone was the same. "Let's use the compass," she said. the first note of uncertainty creeping into her voice. But the compass was acting strangely, the needle spinning lazily before settling in a direction that couldn't possibly be north, based on the time of day and position of the dim sun visible through the fog. "This is useless," Rebecca said, shoving it back into her pack. "Let's just keep heading downhill. We'll hit a stream eventually, and we can follow that." For hours, we pushed through increasingly dense vegetation. The fog never lifted, transforming familiar shapes into looming monsters. Tree branches seemed to reach for us like gnarled hands. The ground became boggy, each step producing a wet, sucking sound. The metallic smell I'd noticed earlier grew stronger, reminding me of old pennies or blood. It was as we crossed a small clearing that I first saw the figures, just glimpses through the mist, gray shapes moving parallel to our path, always at the edge of visibility. When I turned to look directly at them, they seemed to dissolve into the fog. "Rebecca," I whispered, "I think someone's following us." "I know," she replied without turning around. "I've been seeing them for the last hour. Just keep walking." The rational part of my brain suggested they were deer or maybe feral hogs, but something about the way they moved, sometimes upright, sometimes scuttling low to the ground, filled me with primal dread. As daylight began to fade, we stumbled upon an old cabin in a small clearing. Under normal circumstances, I would never have considered entering an abandoned structure in the middle of nowhere. But we were lost, exhausted, and increasingly afraid of spending another night exposed in the hollow. The cabin was small, one room with a stone fireplace, a crude wooden table, and the remains of what might have been a bed frame. The roof was mostly intact, and the walls, though weathered, kept out the wind and mist. Old mason jars lined a sagging shelf, their contents long since turned to unidentifiable mush. The only truly disturbing feature was the collection of small animal skulls arranged in a semicircle on the mantel. Rebecca wanted to remove them, but I insisted we leave everything as we found it. Somehow, disturbing those grinning relics seemed like a terrible idea. We cleared a space on the floor, laid out our sleeping bags, and used our camping stove to heat soup. As darkness fell completely, the sounds began again. The same humming and tapping from the previous night, but now accompanied by soft footsteps circling the cabin. Occasionally, something scratched at the walls or the single boarded-up window. "What do they want?" Rebecca whispered, her face pale in the beam of our failing flashlight. I shook my head, unable to articulate the growing certainty that whatever was out there wasn't human, at least not entirely. Around midnight, the noises stopped suddenly. The silence was almost worse. I was just beginning to hope our tormentors had given up when we heard a new sound. A voice, high and sweet, like a young girl singing an old-fashioned lullaby just outside the cabin door. "Rock-a-bye, baby, in the treetop." Rebecca clutched my hand so tightly I lost feeling in my fingers. "When the wind blows, the cradle will rock." Something rattled the door handle. "When the bough breaks, the cradle will fall." The door began to open slowly, hinges creaking. I lunged forward and slammed my weight against it, fumbling to secure the rusty interior bolt we'd discovered earlier. "And down will come baby, cradle and all." The singing stopped. For one heartbeat, there was absolute silence. Then a voice, still childlike but now distorted, as if speaking through water or thick mud, came from directly outside the door. "Let me in," it said. "I'm so cold out here." "Go away," I shouted, my voice breaking with fear. A soft giggle answered me. "Let me in, William." The use of my name sent ice through my veins. We hadn't encountered another hiker for days, hadn't told anyone in the area our names. "Please, William. Rebecca wants to let me in. Don't you, Rebecca?" I turned to look at Rebecca and felt my heart stop. She was standing rigidly by the fireplace, her hand slowly reaching for the bolt, her eyes fixed on the door with an expression of terrible yearning. "Becca, no!" I leaped across the room and grabbed her arm. Her skin was ice cold. She blinked slowly like someone waking from a trance. "Did you hear her?" "Will." She's just a little girl. She's lost like us." "That's not a child," I hissed, pulling her away from the door. "Think, Becca, whatever's out there knew our names." Something heavy threw itself against the door, making the whole cabin shudder. The childlike voice was gone, replaced by a sound halfway between a growl and a hiss. "Let me in, let me in, let me in." Each demand was punctuated by another impact against the door. The rusty bolt began to bend. Rebecca snapped out of her daze and grabbed her backpack, frantically searching for anything we could use as a weapon. I braced myself against the door, knowing it wouldn't hold much longer. The assault on the door stopped as suddenly as it had begun. After several minutes of silence, I cautiously moved to the small window and scraped a tiny opening in the grime to peer out. The clearing was filled with thick mist illuminated by moonlight. At first, I saw nothing. Then the fog shifted, and I glimpsed them, at least a dozen figures arranged in a semicircle facing the cabin. Some stood upright like humans, others crouched low to the ground. In the dim light, their features were mercifully indistinct, but what I could see was wrong. Limbs too long or too numerous, heads misshapen, mouths that gaped too wide. At the center stood a tall figure in what appeared to be a tattered dress, long hair hanging in front of its face. As if sensing my gaze, it looked up directly at the window. Through the curtain of hair, I saw nothing but empty eye sockets and the dark hollow of a mouth opening impossibly wide. I stumbled back from the window, choking on my own scream. "What did you see?" Rebecca demanded. I couldn't find words to describe it. Instead, I grabbed our packs. "We need to go. Now. Out the back." "There is no back door," she reminded me, her voice surprisingly calm. I was already examining the rear wall of the cabin. The logs were old, some partially rotted. With enough force. "Help me," I said, shouldering my pack and throwing my weight against the weakest-looking section of the wall. Rebecca joined me without question. On the third attempt, the aged timber cracked, creating a gap just wide enough to squeeze through if we removed our backpacks first. I went first, dragging our gear after me, then helped Rebecca through. The back of the cabin faced dense woods rather than the clearing. Without speaking, we grabbed our packs and ran blindly into the forest, away from the cabin and the things surrounding it. We ran until our lungs burned, stumbling over roots and rocks, branches whipping our faces in the darkness. Eventually, we collapsed in a small depression beneath the spreading roots of a massive old oak tree. Dawn was still hours away. "What were they?" Rebecca whispered when she could speak again. "I don't know," I admitted. "Something that doesn't belong here. Maybe something that's always been here." We huddled together for warmth, jumping at every sound in the darkness. Sometimes we heard distant humming or the crack of branches, but nothing approached our hiding place. When gray light finally filtered through the trees, we emerged stiff and exhausted. In daylight, our fears seemed almost foolish. Almost, but not quite. The memory of those figures in the mist was too vivid, the voice that knew our names too real. We had no idea where we were. Our phones remained without signal, and the compass still spun uselessly. With no better option, we decided to head downhill, hoping to find a stream that might lead to civilization. By midday, the fog had returned, thicker than before. The forest around us grew increasingly strange, trees twisted into unnatural shapes, fungi and colors I'd never seen in nature, the constant sensation of being watched. We came across more stone cairns with bizarre symbols carved into them, now arranged in patterns that seemed deliberate, forming rough circles or arrows pointing deeper into the hollow. It was as we passed one such arrangement that Rebecca stopped suddenly. "Will," she said quietly, "that girl from last night. She knew our names." "I know," I replied, eager to keep moving. "That's why it couldn't have been a real child." "No, you don't understand." Rebecca turned to me, her face pale beneath smudges of dirt. "She knew our names, but we never told each other our full names until just now, when you read them on our permits. I only know you as Will, and you only know me as Becca. But whatever that thing was, it called us William and Rebecca, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp air. She was right. In the 2 years we'd been dating, we'd only ever used our nicknames. Our full names would have been on our hiking permit. But who would have seen that except the ranger? "We need to get out of here," I said unnecessarily. "Now." We pushed on with renewed urgency, but the forest seemed to conspire against us. Paths that should have led downhill looped back on themselves. Landmarks we'd passed hours ago reappeared from different directions. By late afternoon, I was forced to admit the truth. We were walking in circles. "Let's climb higher," Rebecca suggested, pointing to a ridge visible through the trees. "Maybe we can get our bearings from there." It was a desperate plan, but the only one we had. We began the steep ascent, using tree roots as handholds on the slippery slope. About halfway up, Rebecca slipped on a moss-covered rock and fell hard, twisting her ankle. "I'm fine," she insisted when I rushed to help her, but her face was contorted with pain, and she couldn't put weight on the injured foot. I helped her to a relatively flat spot and examined her ankle. It was already swelling. Not broken, I thought, but a bad sprain. She wouldn't be able to walk far, certainly not over rough terrain. "You should go for help," she said after I'd wrapped her ankle with our first aid kit. "Follow the ridge. If you can get high enough, maybe your phone will get a signal." "I'm not leaving you," I replied immediately. "Don't be stupid, Will. It'll be dark in a few hours. We both know what happens in this place after dark." She was right, of course. With her injury, we couldn't move quickly enough to find our way out before nightfall. But the thought of leaving her alone, remembering how she'd been almost mesmerized by that thing at the cabin door. 2 hours, I finally agreed. "I'll follow the ridge for 2 hours. If I haven't found help or a signal by then, I'm coming back, and we'll figure something else out." Rebecca nodded, trying to look braver than I knew she felt. I left her with the tent, most of our food, the camping stove, and my jacket for extra warmth. Taking only my phone, the compass, some water, and a power bar, I continued up toward the ridge. The climb was harder than it looked, the slope growing steeper and rocky outcroppings forcing me to find detours. By the time I reached the top, sweat was pouring down my face despite the cool air. I checked my phone immediately, still no signal. From the ridge, I had a panoramic view of the hollow below, a vast bowl of mist-shrouded forest stretching for miles. In the distance, I could make out what might have been the glint of water, a river or lake, and beyond that, faintly, what looked like a tower or tall structure that could indicate civilization. I took careful note of the direction, then looked back the way I'd come, trying to spot where I'd left Rebecca. From this height, the forest canopy was an unbroken sea of green. I'd have to hurry back before I lost the light. I just turned to begin my descent when something caught my eye, a flash of color among the trees far below, on the opposite side of the hollow from where I'd left Rebecca. Red, like her jacket. But that was impossible. She couldn't walk, and I'd left her with my blue jacket anyway. I squinted, trying to get a better look. There it was again, something red moving through the trees. And now I could see a figure, too distant to make out clearly but unmistakably human, walking with the same slight limp Rebecca had developed after her fall. Ice formed in my stomach. There was no way Rebecca could be there. No way at all. I scrambled down the slope, half running, half sliding, desperate to get back to where I'd left her. I called her name as I approached our temporary camp, not caring what else might hear me. The small clearing was empty. The tent was there, my jacket folded neatly on top of it, but Rebecca was gone. I searched frantically, calling until my voice grew hoarse. The only response was the eternal rustling of the forest and, faintly, what sounded like humming. I followed the sound, crashing through underbrush, scratching my arms and face on thorns. The humming grew louder, then stopped. I found myself in another small clearing with a familiar stone cairn at its center. "Rebecca!" I shouted. "Will?" Her voice came from somewhere ahead. "Will, help me!" I ran forward only to find myself at the edge of a steep ravine. Below, through gaps in the canopy, I caught glimpses of Rebecca limping along a narrow path, heading deeper into the hollow. "Rebecca, stop! Wait for me!" I yelled, searching frantically for a way down. She looked up, and even from a distance, I could see something was wrong. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, as if she were a marionette controlled by unskilled hands. When she spoke again, her voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Follow me, Will. I found a way out." Everything in me screamed that this was wrong, that whatever I was seeing wasn't really Rebecca, or wasn't only Rebecca. But what choice did I have? I couldn't leave her, whatever condition she was in. I found a route down the ravine, steep but manageable if I was careful. By the time I reached the bottom, Rebecca was nowhere to be seen, but I could hear her voice calling me onward, always just out of sight. For what seemed like hours, I followed her voice through increasingly unfamiliar territory. The forest grew older, the trees massive and twisted into shapes that seemed deliberate, almost architectural. The ground became soggy, then marshy, until I was wading through ankle-deep water, thick with pale, thread-like plants that clung to my boots. The light was fading when I finally caught up to her. She was standing with her back to me at the edge of a perfect circle of black water, a pool about 30 feet across, its surface unnatural in its stillness. No wind disturbed it, no insects skimmed its surface. The trees around it were dead, their bark blackened as if by fire, their branches reaching toward the center of the pool like supplicating arms. "Rebecca," I said softly, afraid to startle her. She turned slowly. It was her face, her body, but the expression was all wrong. Blank, empty, with eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. "You followed," she said, her voice flat. "Good. She's waiting for you." "Who's waiting?" I asked, taking a step backward. "Becca, what's happened to you?" A smile spread across her face, too wide, showing too many teeth. "She's been waiting so long, Will. Waiting for someone to take her place so she can leave the hollow." As Rebecca spoke, the still surface of the black pool began to ripple. Something was rising from its center, a figure in a sodden dress, long dark hair plastered to its skull and shoulders. It rose until it was standing on the surface of the water, face downturned, water streaming from its clothes and hair. "What is that?" I whispered, unable to look away. "That's Eleanor Pruitt," Rebecca replied, her voice suddenly animated, almost gleeful. "She's been here since 1879. Her husband brought her to the hollow and drowned her in this pool when he found out she was going to have another man's baby. She's been so lonely, Will, but now she can leave." The figure on the water slowly raised its head. I caught a glimpse of a face, once human, now something else, with hollow eyes and skin as pale and translucent as cave fish. Its mouth opened in a smile mirroring the one on Rebecca's face. I knew with terrible certainty what was happening. This thing, Eleanor, had somehow taken possession of Rebecca, drawn her here to this cursed pool. And now it needed me for something even worse. "Rebecca, fight it!" I shouted. "Whatever's controlling you, fight it!" For just a moment, I saw confusion flicker across her face, a flash of the real Rebecca struggling to surface. Then the blank expression returned. "You need to go into the water, Will," she said flatly. "Eleanor needs a man to take her place so she can leave with me. It has to be you." "No," I said, backing away. "Rebecca, this isn't you. You need to fight it." Rebecca's face contorted with sudden rage. "It has to be you," she screamed, her voice overlaid with another, older voice. She lunged at me with inhuman speed, fingers curved like claws. I dodged her attack, but just barely. She was stronger than she should have been, her movements no longer hampered by her injured ankle. As she turned to charge again, I caught a glimpse of her eyes, completely black now, with no white visible. "Rebecca, please," I begged. "I love you. Come back to me." Something flickered in those black eyes. Recognition, fear, desperate pleading. For one heart-stopping moment, I saw my Rebecca looking back at me. "Will," she gasped, her voice her own again. "Run! I can't fight her much longer." "I won't leave you," I insisted. "You have to," she said, her body trembling with the effort of maintaining control. "She won't let me go unless she gets someone else. She needs someone to drown willingly." Behind her, the figure on the water was moving closer, gliding across the surface without creating ripples. Its face was becoming clearer, beautiful once, perhaps, but now a mockery of humanity, with fish-belly skin stretched too tight over protruding bones. "There has to be another way," I said desperately. Rebecca shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "There isn't. I've seen her memories, Will. She's been doing this for 150 years, luring people to the hollow, possessing them, using them to lure others to take their place. The cycle never ends." Her body convulsed suddenly and she fell to her knees. When she looked up, her eyes were black again. "Too late," she said in that horrible dual voice. "Eleanor is coming for you now." The figure from the pool had reached the edge of the water. As it stepped onto land, water cascaded from its dress, but the fabric remained soaked, as if it would never dry. Its feet left wet, black footprints on the marshy ground as it approached. I backed away, looking frantically for an escape route, a weapon, anything that might help. My foot struck something solid, a fallen branch, thick as my arm and heavy. As Eleanor closed in, I swung the branch with all my strength. It connected with her head with a sound like a watermelon being dropped, too soft, too wet. Her head snapped sideways at an impossible angle, neck bending like rubber. But she didn't fall. Instead, her head rotated slowly back into position, black water leaking from her eyes and mouth. Behind her, Rebecca was getting to her feet, movements jerky like a badly operated puppet. They were coming at me from two directions now. In desperation, I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush without any thought except escape. Branches whipped my face. Roots tried to trip me, but I kept running. Behind me, I could hear them following, Rebecca calling my name in that terrible not her voice, and another sound, a wet, slapping noise like sodden clothes dragged over stone. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out. When I finally stopped, gasping for breath, I realized I had no idea where I was. The forest around me was dense and unfamiliar, the light almost gone. Soon it would be fully dark, and I would be alone in the hollow with those things hunting me. As my breathing slowed, I became aware of a new sound, the unmistakable rush of flowing water, a river. If I could find it, maybe I could follow it out of this nightmare. I moved cautiously toward the sound, trying to make as little noise as possible. After about 100 yards, the trees thinned, and I found myself at the edge of a fast-moving river, perhaps 30 feet across, its waters dark in the fading light. For the first time since entering the hollow, I felt a surge of hope. Rivers led to towns, to roads, to people. If I could follow it downstream... A splash behind me shattered my thoughts. I spun around to see a head and shoulders rising from the water, long dark hair plastered to a skull-like face, hollow eyes fixed on me. Eleanor had found another way to pursue me. I turned to run along the riverbank only to see Rebecca emerge from the trees 20 yards downstream, moving with that same puppet-like gait. They had me trapped between them. "You can't escape, Will," Rebecca called, her voice still that horrible blend of herself and something ancient. "The hollow doesn't let people go." Eleanor was pulling herself from the river now, her waterlogged dress clinging to a form that seemed too thin, too angular to be human. As she stood, water poured from her in a continuous stream, as if she were a vessel that could never be emptied. I looked at the river behind me. Dark, fast, unknown. Then, at the two figures closing in, there was only one choice. I backed up to the very edge of the bank. "Rebecca," I called, addressing the thing that had once been the woman I loved. "If you're still in there somewhere, I want you to know I love you. I always will." Then I turned and dove into the river. The cold hit me like a physical blow, driving the air from my lungs. The current grabbed me immediately, tumbling me over and over until I didn't know which way was up. I fought to the surface, gasping for air, only to be dragged under again by the powerful flow. Something grabbed my ankle. A hand, icy cold and inhumanly strong. I kicked frantically and felt my boot connect with something solid. The grip loosened, and the current pulled me free. For what seemed like hours, I battled the river, surfacing for desperate gulps of air, being smashed against rocks, always feeling those cold hands just behind me, reaching, grasping. Sometimes I thought I heard Rebecca calling my name, sometimes singing or humming that terrible lullaby. Eventually, the river widened and slowed. I managed to grab onto a fallen tree and pull myself to the bank where I collapsed, coughing up water, too exhausted to move. It was fully dark now. I lay on the muddy shore, listening for sounds of pursuit, but heard only the normal noises of a forest at night. Insects, the occasional rustle of small animals, the constant rush of the river. When I finally found the strength to stand, I followed the river downstream, moving as quietly as possible. After about an hour, I saw lights through the trees, a road, a bridge spanning the river, and beyond it, buildings. Civilization. I emerged from the forest near a gas station on the outskirts of a small town I later learned was Ironton, miles from where Rebecca and I had started our hike. The bewildered attendant called the police when I stumbled in, soaking wet, covered in cuts and bruises, raving about a woman in the forest. The search for Rebecca lasted 3 weeks. They found our campsite from the first night, our backpacks near where I'd left Rebecca when I climbed to the ridge, and eventually, the cabin with its animal skull collection. But they never found the hollow as I'd experienced it. No black pool, no stone cairns with strange symbols, certainly no drowned woman walking on water. After a month, they officially classified Rebecca as missing, presumed dead from exposure or animal attack. Her parents held a memorial service that I couldn't bring myself to attend. I've spent the 3 years since then researching the hollow and the history of Taumsauk Mountain. I found records of Eleanor Pruitt and her husband, Thomas. He claimed she'd run off with another man, but her body was never found. I found other disappearances in the area over the years, always brushed off as hiking accidents or runaways. Sometimes I convinced myself it was all a hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion, that Rebecca fell or was attacked by an animal while I was gone, and my mind created an elaborate fantasy to cope with the trauma. But then I'll wake in the middle of the night to the sound of humming outside my bedroom window. Or I'll catch a glimpse of a figure in a sodden dress reflected in a store window or a puddle after rain. And I know they're still out there, still waiting. And sometimes, on the worst nights, my phone rings at exactly 3:17 a.m. When I answer, I hear nothing but the faint sound of rushing water and, very softly, Rebecca's voice calling my name. My name is Matthew Gonzalez, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the Ozark Mountains in Missouri last autumn, when the leaves were turning and the air had that crisp chill that makes you want to huddle closer to the campfire. I'd been planning this solo hiking trip for months. After my divorce and the subsequent promotion that chained me to a desk 60 hours a week, I needed to disconnect. My therapist had suggested forest bathing, her new age term for what my grandfather simply called going outside. The Mark Twain National Forest seemed perfect. Remote enough to escape cell service, but with established trails so I wouldn't need to be an expert navigator. I'd chosen a 7-day route that would take me through some of the most secluded parts of the Irish wilderness area. It's an oddly named section of the forest with a dark history, an Irish settlement that mysteriously vanished during the Civil War. Some say the settlers were massacred. Others claim they simply abandoned the harsh terrain. Either way, something about those woods has kept people away for generations. The first 2 days were exactly what I needed. The solitude wrapped around me like a comfortable blanket. I'd wake with the sun, hike until mid-afternoon, set up camp, and spend the evenings reading by firelight or simply watching darkness settle over the forest. The silence was punctuated only by the occasional rustle of wildlife and the whisper of wind through the pines. I felt the knots in my shoulders loosening for the first time in years. On the third day, I reached the edge of what locals call Hollow Creek, a narrow valley with steep ridges on either side and a creek winding through dense undergrowth below. The trail map showed a path following the creek for about 3 miles before climbing back up toward Fiddler's Cave, my planned campsite for the night. The descent into the hollow was steep, with the trail zigzagging down the ridge face. As I made my way down, I noticed the temperature dropping dramatically. Not unusual in valleys, but this felt excessive. By the time I reached the creek bed, my breath was fogging despite it being mid-afternoon in early October. The creek itself was beautiful. Clear water burbling over moss-covered stones, the banks lush with ferns and wildflowers that shouldn't have been blooming so late in the year. I stopped to refill my water bottles, using my portable filter to purify the crystal-clear water. As I knelt by the stream, I noticed strange markings carved into a large, flat rock partially submerged in the water. They looked old, weathered by time and water, but distinctly man-made. Concentric circles with lines radiating outward, like a child's drawing of the sun, but with odd, angular symbols between the rays. I took a photo with my camera, making a mental note to ask the park rangers about it when I returned to civilization. Perhaps it was from the original Irish settlers, or maybe even older. Native American petroglyphs weren't uncommon in the area. As I continued hiking alongside the creek, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had changed. The birdsong that had been my constant companion for days had stopped entirely. The only sound was the gentle murmur of the creek and my own footsteps crunching on the rocky path. The trees grew denser, their canopies intertwining overhead until only thin shafts of sunlight penetrated to the forest floor. The undergrowth seemed to press in on the narrow trail, forcing me to push through branches that seemed to grab at my clothes and pack. By late afternoon, I realized I'd made much less progress than anticipated. According to my map, I should have been climbing out of the hollow by now, but the creek still meandered ahead of me, and the ridges on either side showed no sign of a trail upward. I checked my GPS device, but it showed only a blank screen. Dead battery, I assumed, though I could have sworn I'd charged it fully the night before. With daylight fading faster than it should have, I decided to make camp by the creek rather than risk hiking in the dark. I found a small clearing about 20 feet from the water's edge and set up my tent. As I gathered firewood, I noticed more of those strange symbols carved into trees surrounding my campsite, the same circular pattern I'd seen on the rock. Some looked ancient, the bark having grown around the carvings, while others seemed disturbingly fresh, the exposed wood still pale. I told myself they were trail markers of some kind, though unlike any I'd seen before. Still, an uneasy feeling settled in my stomach as I built my fire larger than usual, as if the flames could ward off the growing sense of wrongness that pervaded the hollow. Night fell with unnatural swiftness. One moment, twilight shadows stretched between the trees. The next, impenetrable darkness pressed against the circle of my firelight. I heated a pouch of dehydrated beef stew for dinner, but found I had little appetite. The food tasted wrong somehow. Not spoiled, just off, as if the spices had been replaced with something similar but not quite right. As I sat by the fire, I became aware of a subtle sound beneath the creek's constant babble, a low, rhythmic humming that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was almost musical, but discordantly so, like several people humming slightly different tunes that occasionally harmonized in ways that made my skin crawl. I tried to distract myself by reading, but couldn't focus on the words. They seemed to shift on the page when I wasn't looking directly at them. I put the book away and decided to turn in early, hoping that morning would bring clarity and an easy path out of the hollow. Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by strange dreams. I was running through endless forest, the trees blurring around me. Something was behind me. Not chasing exactly, but inexorably advancing. And ahead, a woman stood in a clearing, her back to me. She wore old-fashioned clothes, her hair hanging long and dark down her back. When I called out, she began to turn, but I always woke before seeing her face. I startled awake at what my watch said was 3:17 a.m. The humming had grown louder and now seemed to have words within it, not in any language I recognized, but somehow carrying meaning nonetheless. A meaning I strained to understand but couldn't quite grasp. My tent was illuminated by a faint glow from outside, not the warm orange of dying embers, but a cool, bluish light that pulsed in time with the humming. Heart pounding, I unzipped the tent flap just enough to peer out. My fire had died to faintly glowing coals, but the clearing was bathed in pale light emanating from the creek. I watched, transfixed, as ghostly figures moved along the water's edge, translucent forms that were almost human but elongated, their limbs too thin and fingers too long. They seemed to be performing some kind of ritual, moving in patterns that matched the symbols I'd seen carved into the rock and trees. In the center of their circle stood a woman with her back to me, solid where the others were transparent. Her long, dark hair hung down a dress that might have been fashionable a century ago. With a kind of detached horror, I realized she was the woman from my dreams. I must have made some small sound of fear because she suddenly stopped. The humming ceased abruptly. As one, the ghostly figures vanished, melting into the darkness like mist. Only the woman remained, standing motionless by the creek. Slowly, terribly, she began to turn. I frantically zipped the tent closed and burrowed into my sleeping bag, squeezing my eyes shut like a child convinced monsters can't get you if you can't see them. My heart hammered so loudly I was certain she could hear it. I waited for the tent flap to open, for cold fingers to brush against my face. Instead, I heard soft footsteps approaching, stopping just outside my tent. A voice spoke, a woman's voice with an accent I couldn't place. Old-fashioned, lilting, with hard consonants and drawn-out vowels. "You shouldn't be here, traveler," she said softly. "This hollow belongs to Eleanor Hollow, to me. We don't take kindly to trespassers." I wanted to speak, to apologize, to explain I was just passing through, but my voice had abandoned me. My body felt leaden with terror. "I'll allow you until dawn," she continued. "Be gone by first light or join the others who've come to my waters. They sing with me now, beneath the creek. They sing so prettily." The footsteps retreated. Only when they had faded entirely did I realize I'd been holding my breath. I lay awake the rest of the night, too terrified to sleep, too terrified to leave the illusory safety of my tent. When the first gray light of dawn filtered through the tent fabric, I packed with shaking hands and fled. I didn't bother with breakfast or proper packing, just stuffed everything haphazardly into my backpack and started hiking downstream as fast as the treacherous terrain would allow. The forest seemed different in the pale morning light, less oppressive, but somehow more watchful. The humming was gone, but the silence that replaced it felt expectant, as if the woods were holding their breath. After about an hour of frantic hiking, I rounded a bend in the creek and stopped short. Ahead of me stood an old stone foundation, the remains of what must have been a small cabin or mill. The stones were weathered and covered with moss, but still formed a recognizable rectangle with what might have been a fireplace at one end. What made me freeze wasn't the unexpected ruin, but what occupied it. Sitting on the crumbled wall was a man, flesh and blood, not ghostly, dressed in contemporary hiking gear not unlike my own. He looked to be in his 60s, with a thick white beard and deeply tanned skin that spoke of a lifetime outdoors. He nodded at me casually, as if encountering another person in this forgotten corner of the wilderness was the most natural thing in the world. "Morning," he called. "You look like you've seen a ghost." There was something knowing in his tone that made my skin prickle. I approached cautiously. "I had a strange night." "Camped in the hollow, did you?" He shook his head. "Not the wisest choice. I'm Hank Thornton, by the way, local guide." "Matthew Gonzalez," I replied automatically. What do you mean, not wise? Hank gestured for me to sit on the wall opposite him. As I did, he pulled a thermos from his pack and offered me a cup of coffee, which I accepted gratefully. "This place has history," he said, looking around. "Bad history, the kind that leaves scars on the land." He nodded toward the creek. "That's Hollow Creek, named after Eleanor Hollow. She wasn't part of the Irish settlement, came later, in the 1870s. Set up as a healer, though some called her a witch." I sipped the coffee, its warmth and normalcy anchoring me. "I think I saw her last night." Hank didn't look surprised. Folks who camp in her hollow often do. Story goes she was drowned in that creek by the men of a nearby settlement after a child died under her care. They claimed she'd cursed the boy for stealing herbs from her garden. "The symbols," I said suddenly, "carved in the rocks and trees." "Protection marks," Hank nodded. "Some made by Eleanor herself, others by folks trying to ward her off after her death. They say she pulls people into the creek, travelers who stray into her hollow after dark. Their spirits join her there, trapped." He eyed me carefully. "You're lucky she let you leave." "How do you know so much about this place?" I asked, suspicion finally penetrating my fear. "And what are you doing out here?" Hank smiled sadly. "My great-grandmother was one of the few who defended Eleanor. Claimed she was innocent. After what happened, my family appointed themselves unofficial guardians. We try to keep people away from the hollow, especially at night. I patrol these woods most days, but I can't catch everyone." He stood, hoisting his pack. "The trail you want is about half a mile ahead. It'll take you up out of the hollow to Fiddler's Cave. From there, it's a clear path back to the main trail system." As he turned to leave, I called after him. "The others she mentioned, the ones who sing beneath the creek, are they real?" Hank paused. 9 hikers have gone missing in this area over the past 50 years. Never found, despite extensive searches. He looked back at me, his expression grave. "I've heard them singing on quiet nights when the moon is dark." With that, he walked away, disappearing among the trees before I could ask anything more. I found the trail exactly where Hank had indicated and climbed gratefully out of the hollow, the oppressive atmosphere lifting with each foot of elevation I gained. By the time I reached Fiddler's Cave, a large, shallow depression in the cliff face, I had almost convinced myself that lack of sleep and isolation had caused me to hallucinate the entire experience. Almost. I spent that night at a designated campsite, comforted by the presence of 2 other hiking groups nearby. The rest of my trip passed without incident, and I returned to civilization with what I thought would be just a strange story to tell around future campfires. But 3 things happened after my return that prevent me from dismissing what occurred in Hollow Creek. First, my camera, which had been working perfectly throughout the trip, contained no record of the strange symbols I'd photographed. Those photos were simply missing, though all others remained intact. Second, when I tried to locate Hollow Creek on detailed topographic maps of the area, I found nothing. The creek existed. I hadn't imagined that, but it was unnamed on every map I consulted. When I mentioned Hollow Creek to a park ranger, she looked momentarily startled before saying she wasn't familiar with that name. Third, and most disturbing, about a month after my return I received a small package at my apartment. No return address, postmarked from Van Buren, Missouri, the nearest town to where I'd hiked. Inside was a single item, an old, sepia-toned photograph showing a woman in Victorian-era clothing standing beside a creek I recognized all too well. Her face was obscured, turned slightly away from the camera, but her long dark hair and posture were unmistakable. On the back, in faded handwriting, Eleanor Hollow, 1873. Beneath it, in fresher ink, "She remembers you." I've moved twice since then and changed my phone number. I've told no one where I've gone, but sometimes when I'm falling asleep, I hear a faint humming, like distant voices singing beneath water. And in my dreams, Eleanor Hollow is always turning to reveal her face. I wake before she completes the turn, and I pray I always will.